Heavy metal.
Did you ever read Heavy Metal magazine?
A few issues. I did see both the movies. There was really, where I lived growing up, there was no way to get a hold of heavy metal. I grew up in a small ass town, so
They'd have known if you were getting Heavy Metal, if you even had it available. You couldn't it wasn't like that discreet, semi-pornographic magazine that you could get without anybody knowing it.
no, I would have had to drive into Milwaukee or Waukesha to get it. I don't even, to be honest with you, I don't even think I knew about it until the movie.
How'd you see the movie?
Bootleg VHS, I think.
Yeah, because for a long time it wasn't available on any format except you see theatrical. If you could see like a print of it at a revival theater or something.
Yeah, it was like it was definitely a bootleg. I remember I had gone to, and it must have been when I was 18 or 19, because we had a comic convention in Milwaukee, which wasn't very big at the time. But I picked up like probably a dozen bootleg movies, and that was one of them. So
What about this have been?
I liked it. It kind of had that what's the deal? I'm trying to think of one. It had that eerie kind of vibe to it. I can't remember what I'm trying to think. But
You talking about, when you say eerie, are you talking about like the Warren magazines and stuff, like Vaporella and the like, or just like eerie as in just generally having a vibe to it, like that cult movie, forbidden quality?
Yeah, almost kind of like a creep show, almost. I guess they would have the if I'm remembering right, creep show would have like one of their movies was like three little. It was like an anthology. And I kind of got the same vibe from that. So, but that's as far as my heavy metal knowledge goes.
And when about did you see the movie though?
When? So that would have been 93, 94, somewhere around there.
And what did you think about the sequel?
I liked the sequel because there was hit, but it wasn't the same. It was a good little cartoon, but
What about the soundtracks?
soundtracks were cool. Couldn't tell you now what I know it was all like hard rock stuff, but I can't recall off the top of my head. I probably at the time when I watched the second movie, I probably liked the second movie better because it was just a long action deal, and I think it was the first time I had seen tits in cartoon form, and I was like, whoa. But I think I watched them both a couple of years ago, and I like the first one a lot better now. So
I think the quality of the tits was better in the first one too.
it could have been. Was there tits in the first one too?
Oh yes.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, then maybe it was the first one that I was just like, oh yeah. I don't know. I sound like a fucking creepo.
Oh well, no. I mean, we're talking about heavy metal. If you don't talk about breasts, I don't think you're doing it right.
Yeah, then I thought that about the first. Then I did like the first one a lot.
Columbia Pictures takes you beyond the future to a universe you've never seen before.
I think you're going a little high, man.
It's okay, man. If there's one thing I know, it's how to drive when I'm stoned. It's like your perspective's fucked, so you just gotta let your hands work the controls as if you're straight.
Oh, wow. Good landing, man.
A universe of mystery.
Okay, sucker. Hand over your cash. Now.
A universe of sexual fantasies.
My whips.
Harry? Can I sleep with you?
That was incredible. I've never felt anything like it.
A universe of magic. a step beyond science fiction.
I didn't see it theatrically, so I can't really my first viewing of Heavy Metal was while I was unemployed 2 weeks ago. So I can't, as far as that goes, I can't really put myself in the sneaking into the the bizarre theatrical sneak into the dollar show like Mr. Fix-It had or whatever the fuck your story was. Not that I wasn't paying attention, but
apparently you were not.
Well, I just streamed it. Like there's nothing romantic to it. So I will happily discuss the film, but any more nostalgic related anecdotes related, it's not getting it for me.
So we'll begin at the beginning of the movie. It starts with the story is Soft Landing. It's based on the comic of the same name by Dan O'Bannon and Thomas Workington. Dan O'Bannon, of course, is definitely part of that zeitgeist.
Return of the Living Dead.
Right. This is the guy that worked with John Carpenter in the early days on his student film, created Aliens, obviously heavily influenced by guys like H.R. Geiger and Moebius. And, a ton of these people were all gathered together by Alejandro Jodorowsky to do the failed 70s attempt at Dune. And a lot of heavy metal influence went into that project, or the fact that project existed maybe influenced heavy metal being transported over from France to the United States. So the sequence is pretty straightforward. It plays over the song Radar Rider by Riggs. And you want to explain it, fix it?
Basically, it's just an astronaut in a Firebird?
Corvette.
A Corvette. And he's being launched out of a fucking space shuttle to land on Earth, and it's rotoscope, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so, just, fucking cool beginning. And as the car is entering the atmosphere, it pulls out a parachute, it lands. He drives up to a farmhouse, his farmhouse. He arrives, his daughter screams, "What did you bring me?" He laughs, takes off, walks in, and introduces us to the Lochnar.
Why don't you introduce the listeners to the Lochnar?
It's a glowing green ball, right? Lochnar, and which is so Heavy Metal. This animated film is a series of short stories, but Lochnar is sort of the
glue
link
that holds it all together.
Yeah, it's the link between all of them. It's the commonality through all these stories. The stories go all through time and scenarios and whatnot, but they all kind of surround Lochnar, the glowing green ball from space.
When Dark Star was released in the early to mid-70s, the John Carpenter, Dan O'Bannon project, the movie poster was an image from toward the end of the picture featuring astronauts surfing through space. In this case, he was surfing on debris. And very much captures the feel of the times and that feel of heavy metal. And I always kind of figured that this story was maybe riffing off of that, since it's also Dan O'Bannon. There's something in some of the movie posters for heavy metal also features the Corvette being dropped in the lower, in the upper atmosphere and slowly careening down to Earth. Very excellent introduction credit sequence for something like this. Very reflective of the aesthetic and badass song. I like Radar Rider. In particular, I got a car a while back, and it was the first time I had a car that was radar ready. That actually helped, they would detect vehicles around you and shit. Usually I got decade-old beaters, and I finally got an actual new car. And because of that, radar ready would appear whenever I turn on the car. I was constantly thinking, radar, 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 rider, whenever I would drive that vehicle. So, what do you guys think of the song?
Dude, the whole soundtrack's amazing. Now, I'm curious what Matt thinks, because this is early metal.
It's all like yacht rock shit.
Fuck you.
But no, it's okay. It's all yacht rock. But I don't say
metal.
Shit. Is it better? No, it's not metal. It's yacht rock. It's look. I was surprised. There's a lot of names in the soundtrack that I knew, but I think let me see. I might have made a note on a couple tracks I actually recognized. But outside of Heavy Metal by Sammy Hagar, because you used it in one song each, I don't think any of them really jumped out. Could I be wrong? I could be wrong. I gotta reread through these notes. It's been a couple weeks. All right.
Well, we're gonna go through the songs and we're gonna talk about the movie, so you'll have opportunity. You have this magazine in France called Metal Hurlant. Starts in 1974, translates into Howling Metal. Does well enough that they carry it over to the United States in 1977, redub it Heavy Metal, and that's when the magazine gets started. Now, Mr. Fix-It, you didn't read the magazine first. I know you have an origin story with relation to heavy metal, so I know you've kind of already told it, but if you want to tell like a short version of it again, we can hear that.
Went to a local comic shop. I'm digging through bins, find this magazine-sized comic. Looks pretty cool. Start flipping through it. Oh, look, there's boobies. And at the time, I am a youngster, so I'm shocked that no one is telling me anything. I take it to, and actually, this was a guy that used to go to your shop. He had his own shop. Yeah, he ran his shop out of his house or some shit.
Well, no, before that, he ran the satellite Third Planet that they had in Pasadena, back over near the drive-through liquor store.
So I think it was there I bought it. I want to say it was definitely with him. But I find this adult comic book, and it was definitely eye-opening. And so, I bought one copy. I think he only had one copy at the time. So, flip through it. There's a lot of nudity, a lot of violence. I hadn't seen that yet in comics because I'm still, just a Marvel fanboy. And then I think I went to a Walgreens and I found one there. Like they had it on the magazine rack. And I remember thinking, holy shit, like it's here. And so I was allowed to purchase it, which I was shocked. And I started kind of following it. You would find them at different comic shops in the back in the what do you call it, the long boxes. And that was pretty much it, man. That was my exposure to the comic first before the movie came out.
So I thought that you'd seen the movie 40 years ago when it first came out. Did you?
No, I did. We did in the theaters, but I was exposed to the comic first, or the book, because I remember seeing that first.
Really? Okay, because we're talking like 81, dude. You saw the magazine before you saw the movie?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. And the guy, the Third Planet guy, that place was open that far back?
Well, no. He had the other shop. It was another shop. It was like a house.
Okay, so he had a house, because this I wasn't aware of, is the guy you're talking about. I know that he ran a Third Planet satellite store, because that was pretty much the first.
South Houston.
Right. That was pretty much the first proper standalone comic shop I ever saw. And it was funny because I'd lived in that neighborhood for like a year or so, and I found that shop like within a few weeks of us moving. So I only got to enjoy it for a very small amount of time, and we moved out of state too. That's when we moved to Nevada. So it was very frustrating to have a comic shop for such a brief blip of time. And then years later, when I'm running comic shops, I become aware that this guy had run a shop out of his house, and he'd more or less shut it down because I think he wasn't getting his bills paid to Diamond. And so he kept his back stock though. And so I would go to his house, I'd call him up, or back when you had to call people, they didn't have text back then. I'd call him up and I'd make arrangements to go into his attic, or not his attic, his garage. And I'd spend hours digging through his boxes that were just piled up in his garage, choking on the cat hair that was every fucking where. You remember that shit. And what was cool is the dude was like I think he had done construction, and so he made good money, and then he pumped a ton of money into his comic collection and other like fan stuff, but mostly the comics and magazines. And he had really eclectic taste. He'd open the shop, he'd close the shop, but the shop was mostly based on the stuff that he bought that he liked anyway. And so you could definitely find like really cool shit like heavy metal because he was into cool stuff. He was just that kind of guy. And then eventually I think he finally like sold off the stuff, or I don't know what ended up happening to the guy, because I think we lost contact with him before I closed my last shop. But he was really good for that kind of stuff. But I did not realize that he had started out having a garage thing, then did the Third Planet thing, and then went back to the garage. That's a kind of a shit trajectory.
I want to say that's because I remember he was even renting. I don't know. It was in his garage. I remember it was in his garage, like all the books. Like he would just open. Like, well, no, you would go through the side. He had all the books in the garage, and then his house shop. But I don't think he had a name or anything for the shop yet. The only reason I knew about it was because I knew friends that were going there, and they would say, "Hey, let's go to the shop." Because at that time, I think we would go to Third Planet every once in a while, but you had to find a family member to drive you out there, which was kind of hard to do sometimes. But I want to say my exposure, I was exposed to the comic first. Now, my dad took us to go see the movie, and I always remember we saw it because we did a double feature that night where my father took us to go see Back to the Future in the early evening, and then that night we went and saw heavy metal at like a fucking midnight showing in this fucking mall theater that was out in the middle of nowhere. I remember that because me and my sister, I think I've already told that story where there's all these dudes in black t-shirts and blue jeans, and I'm just like, where the fuck are we? Like, what is going on? And my dad's there with his girlfriend, and me and my sister are sitting there, and my dad sits me and my sister in the front of him. She falls asleep pretty immediately, and the fucking intro starts up, and I'm like, okay, this is kind of cool. But I didn't correlate the movie and the comics together, because dude, the comics were out. The book was out longer than that, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean the magazine was out in the United States in '77. The cartoon came out in '81. So yeah, a fair few years ahead of time. And plus, if you're in comic shops, if you're checking out the newsstand, the opportunity to find heavy metal was more readily available. Whereas catching a movie, it was kind of up to your parents whether or not you get to go to that. And of course, we've joked about how inappropriate it was for your dad to take you to that fucking movie.
Yeah.
So most of us wouldn't have gotten the chance to even go to the movie if we'd wanted to in that time period because our parents would have known better than to take us to that shit.
Well, my dad has a unique parenting philosophy when it comes to that shit. So we were definitely raised a little different than most kids. I mean, I don't know many parents who would drop off their youngsters at a fucking, back then it was what, Super Track, and just stuff a 20 in your pocket and be like, I'll be back in 2 hours. And then you just kind of fend for yourself at an arcade for 2 hours.
I mean, I think that's how all of us were raised, dude. My mom did the same thing.
Really?
Yeah, she would just drop us off in an arcade and give us home, or a mall or whatever. And that's what it was, bro.
Yeah, well, no, the mall thing was normal, but the mall you were kind of safe. Dude, we're going to a fucking video game arcade place at like midnight, or not that late, maybe kind of like 8-ish, 9-ish. And I don't know, I just always thought it was kind of crazy because we'd be dropped off and like it's just me and my step siblings and my sister kind of fending for ourselves and just, you know, trying to be careful. And I mean, I never felt like in danger. Nowadays, dude, I would never do that with my kid in a million years. Like, I don't know about y'all. I think that's fucking insane.
Dude, we used to, like, I was at a buddy's house. This is when we lived in northern Arizona. And we needed something from his dad. And his dad owned, like, a realtor agency, a real estate agency across town. So he didn't answer his phone. So we just got on our bikes and rode there. Dude, I've, like, kind of tried to map it from memory. And it was, like, 25 miles through, like, the mountains of northern Arizona on our bikes. And we went there. And I think we even showed up and he was like, what the fuck are you doing here? Like, how did you get here? This would drop you off? We're like, no, we just rode our bikes all the way across town. Busy highway. Like, we're like on the shoulder of highways and stuff, just riding around. It's bizarre to think. And now it's like, if your kids ride more than, 1,000 feet to a school on their bikes, it's like you're a horrible parent. It's so bizarre.
Sure.
Yeah, I think there was elements of that in amongst baby boomers, but definitely Generation X. The feral nature of our upbringing. We were called the latchkey generation for a reason. We just had like bizarre levels, what today would be considered bizarre levels of freedom. The first segment within the movie is Harry Canyon. It's been said that this story influenced books and movies like The Abyss, Blade Runner, Star Wars, Alien Tron, and The Fifth Element. It's based on the original story by Daniel Goldberg and Lynn Blum, based on The Long Tomorrow by Moebius. And I think it was actually Moebius with Dan O'Bannon. So again, O'Bannon had a pretty heavy influence.
Morbius?
Huh?
Say his name again?
I say Moebius.
Okay.
Yeah, whatever the artist, the French artist, the guy who designed like the space suits for Alien and was one of the more prominent creators among the French, but also among European sci-fi and fantasy. And this is basically your typical boilerplate, private dick kind of story, except that the detective isn't actually a detective. It's a taxi driver, very much shades of The Fifth Element there. And he picks up a hot girl who's being chased by monsters, and they're all after the Loch-Nar, essentially. And so, there's dirty dealings, and people get melted into puddles of goo, and just that whole aesthetic, that whole, sci-fi mixed with old pulps, where you're not, nobody's basing any new technologies on anything we're seeing in this segment, but it definitely has that vibe that you'd expect from something like Cyberpunk. And I've looked at the original The Long Tomorrow, and it's a very, very, very loose adaptation. For starters, everybody in the Moebius story, it looks like somebody from a Moebius story, so they've got the weird, like, safari hats and long coats and all this kind of goofy shit. But, it has an interesting, like, the art style used is very interesting because it looks very much like somebody drawing with a ballpoint pen. It doesn't look like any kind of animation before or really since, because it has that crude old quality to it. And given that this is based on a Moebius story, it looks nothing like Moebius as far as the presentation. It's very American and very grungy.
It is Mobius, but just so we know, it's Mobius.
I was gonna say Mobius, but
M-O-E, like Mo, like Larry Moe and Curly. Although I don't know, is that Mo M-O-E? I don't know. It's Mobius. But yeah, as soon as you said, I already had Fifth Element written in my notes. I'm like, dude, it's total Fifth Element vibe from in the very beginning. He's like a taxi driver. He comes across this woman. Like that's the whole that is the Fifth Element, like bare bones from the very beginning. Now obviously the women turn out to be different, but I loved how at the very end, because she basically are we going to like the actual story of these things or not?
As much as you guys feel like you need to.
Okay, so basically, what do you call it? This woman's husband had Loch-Nar.
I think it was her dad.
No, the dad found it. Yes, because they're out there digging. Because that's a Psychic War by
Blue Oyster Cult.
Cool metal song. What was that, Frank?
Yeah, the veteran of the Psychic Wars by Blue Oyster Cult. Don't Fear the Reaper guys.
But the father.
It reminds me too. It sends me back because because in my message board days back in the late 90s, I knew a guy who listed his occupation as veteran of the Psychic Wars. So that always reminds me of that cool song too. Nice little like dirge thing.
Very metal. But that the father finds it. The assistant who was picking it up melts away. So they're like, oh shit. The next scene we have the father being shot, falls through the door. The daughter's running away, being chased by the gangsters. She hops into Harry's cab. Harry starts driving. Next is I'm trying to remember the name of the song. Was it
True Companion by Donald Fagen?
No.
Because that one I don't remember as well. Or are you talking about Blue Lamp by Stevie Nicks?
No, that's later. I can't remember the name of the song. But the song's playing. He's being followed by two of these guys in we call it hover bike. He shoots one off. He kills one with this cool gun that pops out of his back tail light. The other one smashes into an overhead bridge. They go and hide. Or he decides to see where she wants to be taken. Looks in the back. She's passed out. Takes her to the police station and walks into the police station. The wonderful, truly missed John Candy is voicing the cop behind the counter. There's some prostitutes sitting there telling Harry they'll kiss his ass for $5. And of course, you have the little green alien being dragged out, saying that he's an American citizen. He just forgot his document. And of course, Harry's like, God damn illegal aliens. And let's see, the cop says that you actually have to pay for the police to do an investigation. Harry's like, here's $5, flips him a coin, calls him a punk. Harry decides to take her home. He's trying to be nice, tells her she can sleep on the couch. He'll sleep on the bed. He's making himself a sandwich with a lot of mayonnaise for some reason, and gets into bed. And that's that was the first time I ever saw the Raiders emblem used in a bush as she's coming to the bed to seduce Harry. Am I going to do the whole episode? Huh?
The Raiders emblem? She had the Raiders emblem?
Dude, that's the Raiders emblem in her bush.
Oh, I guess I totally missed. Maybe I was typing a note when that happened.
Oh, no, dude. I saw that. I was like, dude, she has like a massive bush. Like, wow, that's a lot of bush. He gives her the stars and stripes forever, as he likes to say, and as he's going at it. Let's see, what else?
Now, if I remember correctly, when they're going at it, that's when they play Open Arms by Journey, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and that's one of those, like, Blue Lamp by Stevie Nicks, I think is a nice enough song, and I'm not a big enough Stevie Nicks guy to would have heard it anyplace else. I like Fleetwood Mac, and I like Nicks, but with Nicks solo stuff especially, I'm more of a singles guy. And I like the song Fine, although it's a really weird, element in this soundtrack. It feels like it doesn't necessarily fit. And given that not all the songs in the movie make it onto the official release soundtrack, it's weird that was one of the ones that they actually did make it onto there. But something about Open Arms by Journey, you don't get much less metal than Journey, Like, it's almost
okay,
like...
Journey is not metal, I'll give you that.
And again, Open Arms is a really lovely love song, and they're fucking. So it's like, I don't know if that's... Like, I really wish there'd been something a little dirtier playing over that, because they make it seem like this is the love of a lifetime, and it's like, no, they're fucking, and that's all they're doing is fucking.
Well, anyway, so she decides that. Okay, so after they seduce, hold on, I actually have the movie playing in the background now. That is definitely the Raiders logo in a tan color.
Take a picture and text it to me.
So yeah, and I remember sitting in the theater as a child watching this going, holy shit, there's a theater full of dudes, man. Sausage fest 100%. It was definitely an odd moment.
Were there any girls at the showing? Seriously?
I think there was. No, I think there was some girls, like, but your typical metal chicks.
Now, I know you were a young child, but let's do a little gatekeeping. Were there girls or were there girlfriends?
I just remember a lot of black shirts and a lot of blue jeans. Now, a lot of long hair, so, it's a 50-50 shot there, man. From behind, it's a 50-50 shot.
Yeah, right. Like you couldn't necessarily tell for sure if they were girls, much less girlfriends.
All body types were represented at this show. So if you were to have them all face forward and look at it from behind, I don't know, man. You could go 50-50, man. Women, I don't know. I mean, the ratio of male to female would be really odd to pull off. I'm not lying, dude. It was like literally all black shirt, all blue jeans. Everyone had long hair. It was, it's like going to a Megadeth concert.
Shots fired.
Okay. So what? Basically, she's wanting Harry Canyon, right? To protect her. And don't they like these mobster dudes that want Lochnar? Like they're gonna arrange, like, because they're trying to kill her, and they're like, if you just get his Lochnar, they're gonna leave her alone.
Yeah, well, because what it is it's worship in all over the universe, and so these mobsters have some buyers who want it, and they just want it back from her. So she decides to sell it to them, and she'll split it with Harry, and she's like, oh, she starts playing up that she's madly in love with Harry. So Harry's like, sure, why not? So they go, and I mean, it's a legitimate drop off. She drops it off. They give her a case full of cash. She walks off. She gets back in the cab. Harry's excited, talking about how they're going to travel and do this and that. And she decides, nah, she's going to double cross him. Oh, and I forgot to mention that Harry has this little device where he has a button by the gas pedal where he flips up and he steps on it, and a disintegrator ray hits the back seat, and he ends up disintegrating her.
Because she double crosses him, right? And
She's
like, oh,
yeah.
sorry, I had to do this. And she pulls a gun on him or whatever. So he fucking nukes her. And then don't the mobster dudes, they have Lochnar and they like touch it.
Well,
and
no. He opens it to like look at the Lochnar and be like, you know, he owns it, and it disintegrates him like anybody else. And then it starts to float off. And then it goes back. So where we left off was wherever they do the soft landing, the Lochnar's talking to a little girl, telling her the stories of basically, I mean, his greatness, like how he's worshipped around the universe, and it's you know, like Frank was saying, it's an anthology, but it's a way to tell the stories where he's telling their stories, which I thought was always weird. He's telling us, and the globe or the orb is getting larger as he's telling these stories, and the girl is freaking out because it's her father's already been killed.
Well, I think what it was, I don't think that they trusted American audiences to allow this to be a true anthology without any connective tissue, that they had to have like an overarching narrative to drive them. Because it's very rare to see any American movies that don't have a framing sequence for something like this. And so everything has to be forced because it doesn't really make sense. And most of these stories were written to be taken in isolation. They weren't supposed to connect to anything else besides, you know, they were just a story. So trying to work the Lochnar in there some way, somehow, it's not going to necessarily pass a strong logic test, but it gets the job done. It's a green orb. It's evil. It's telling stories of how it does all this evil shit, starting out this little girl, you know, because it's a misogynist. I don't know what the fuck, but that's the framing sequence. You know, you forgive it because you know it's just there to as guardrails for the noobs. I certainly remember roaming around the mall without a parent for hours on end. We would go to the bowling alley, and my stepfather would be bowling. My mother would, I guess, be watching him or bullshitting with the lady who worked at the counter of the little dining area they had. And I'd be roaming around, or I'd find some other kid, and we'd cross the street in the, you know, 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night on a weekend and go to like the Walgreens across the street or whatever, or just wander around the neighborhood in the dark, you know, shit. We all did that kind of fucking shit. You know, it was just part of our generation. And I think that heavy metal kind of reflects that because, you know, literally this was approved porn. Like,
yes.
I mean, my first exposure was off the newsstand. You know, you go to a convenience store or something, and of course you would have actual pornography behind the counter. But back in the 80s especially, you'd have heavy metal next to, you know, your Savage Sword of Conan, you know, the Marvel black and white magazines and shit.
Exactly where I saw it, yeah.
Yeah, and it's in full color. You crack it open. It doesn't take long before you start seeing some tits. There was always going to be some tits in every issue at least. But oftentimes they'd go full on skin and back soft core. You wouldn't see any cocks for the most part.
Some of the stories you would, dude.
Some of the stories you would. You wouldn't see graphic penetration though, definitely.
But they definitely described.
Sure. Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I was like, holy shit.
It was in this weird place, this gray area where because the material was intended for older audiences and because there was a novelistic quality to it, that there was an allowance for a greater degree of explicit nature. Plus, it pulled the same thing that Mad Magazine had done years earlier, where they weren't restricted by the Comic Code Authority or any other governing body because they were a magazine, not a comic book. And so they were in that gray area where you get away with that shit. And if you remember on the newsstand, it wasn't the only one. If you got Savage Sword of Conan, there were tits in those as well, even though they're Marvel books, you could still see tits. Or you'd get like cartoons or the Lowrider magazines, and they usually had some nudity in it as well. So it was an interesting little thing where it was almost like before the internet, before people were exposed to shit that was warping their fucking minds, that was like a degree of maturity. It's like when you get old enough to find the heavy metal and get home with it, then you were age appropriate to be buying it. Essentially, it was a tacit approval that okay, you're old enough to if you can afford. I think it was like $4 or $5 at a time where most comics were like 75 cents to $1.25. If you could afford it and get it home without anybody harassing you, then you'd earned it and you were mature enough to have it.
Yeah. So like I never ever saw, I don't think I ever flipped through a heavy metal magazine.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it was ever really, if we were trying to sneak a peek at some like faux porn, we were just going for like real porn. So I don't know, it was like, I kind of kept my porn and my comic books separate, if that makes any sense. I don't want to mingle these two things. Yeah. So yeah, I never, like I would always see them back behind the counter, right, where you're not supposed to, you know, because you could always see the heavy metal logo that looked cool, it was all chrome and polished, right? But you know, it was always next to more appealing magazines for a budding young adolescent such as myself. So yeah, I never went to enough comic book shops that I never lucked into a Heavy Metal just out on a rack where I could pick it up and flip through it. So I think by the time I really got my hands on a Heavy Metal magazine, it was sort of like, oh, this is some this is like some overly painted power metal fantasy stories with some boobs in it, and it wasn't that big a deal to me. But I could see how if I had been maybe 10 years younger and I'd stumbled across one, it'd be pretty crazy. But by the time I actually got my hands on Heavy Metal, I already kind of knew what it was all about, so it wasn't that big of a deal.
Yeah, that makes sense because there's still a little bit of an age difference between Fix-It and me and you, because when we would get a hold of Heavy Metal, there was no behind the counter. It was on the rack next to all the other magazines. And that was before they had poly bags, so anybody could walk up, pick up the Heavy Metal, and start tossing through it. And part of, I think, the reason why I got away with it for as long as it did is the only people who would have wanted to look through an issue of Heavy Metal were the ones who weren't going to rat anybody out about it existing. It's like we were if you wanted something like Heavy Metal, you were already in the club, and you knew that you needed to keep this your own special secret because you didn't want anybody else to know that you were getting a hold of that particular magazine, because you knew it was illicit. You knew that you weren't supposed to have it, and if people knew the secrets of it, then they would take it away from you. And if ultimately they did, because at some point somebody decided to start polybagging it or putting it behind the counter, and that's what you were talking about. By the time it got to you, you didn't have that access anymore.
Yeah, and again, if it's in the general population of magazines, it's probably a big deal. Once you're back behind the counter, is a lot of competition for you, Heavy Metal. Sorry, at least from a nudity standpoint. Yeah, sorry.
A thing too, you mentioned the comic shops, and Heavy Metal is a really bizarre magazine because it launches in the 70s at a time when mainstream comic fans are really abandoning the anthology, because there was a time where anthology was king. Like all comic books were anthologies in the early days, in the 30s and stuff, because you wanted to make sure you got as broad an audience as possible. So you'd have, an adventure strip next to a comedy strip, next to a funny animal one, they was all mixed together. Here's a grab bag, right? And then as the comic books got slimmer and slimmer, because they didn't want to raise the price, the subject matter got more and more specific, and you basically had genres, and some genres sold better than others, and some were geared toward older audiences. You look at the 50s, you've got the crime books, you've got the horror books, and the little kids really weren't supposed to get their hands on it, and if they did, then it was sort of the 50s equivalent of the Heavy Metal, where the kid was getting something they knew they weren't supposed to get. And then of course you had the delinquency hearings, and all comic books got banned because of that, or the majority of them, and you had to have the Comics Code seal to get distributed at all, and so everything got super squeaky clean and wholesome. But you still had anthologies, you still had like the soft the thriller stuff, your House of Mystery and Tales of Suspense and House of Secrets, that kind of stuff, where it was a very pussified version of the type of stuff that EC used to do. And I think because they were so weak sauce, and because you had the increasing dominance of superheroes, because all the other genres were on television and movies, if you wanted a Western, you could just watch a fucking Western. Why would you do with a Western comic book? And so when it became apparent that superheroes was one of the only things that comic books were able to do better than they could in any other outside medium, they really came to dominate. And I think a combination of the weakness of the anthology stories, the ascendance of superhero ongoing soap opera narratives, and just the simple fact that fewer and fewer casual readers were reading comic books when they would just as soon watch television instead, there just wasn't that much of a demand for it. And then at the same time in the 1970s, not only do you get an anthology magazine out, but it's mostly made up of international material. It's mostly repackaging shit from Europe, so it does very specific taste. But again, because you had that high fantasy, sci-fi, and the adult mature qualities to it, it attracted a mainstream audience that had mostly dropped comic books. But what's weird is it doesn't seem like mainstream superhero people ever really embraced Heavy Metal. You almost never saw Heavy Metal in the comic shops. I always saw it on the newsstand. I really feel like that was a different audience, that there were it was just outside of the norm of superhero type shit, comic shop type people. And I think that because of the general bias against the anthologies that comic book fans had, there's this real prejudice against Heavy Metal. And it just doesn't, it's never in my experience had a strong presence in comic shops. To this day, really, if you're going to get an issue of Heavy Metal, you're probably going to go to a bookseller like a Barnes & Noble. And I know those are somewhat of an endangered animal as well, but certainly I see a lot more Heavy Metal in the bookstores to this day than I ever have in the comic shop.
Yeah, and you know what? I think my experience with Heavy Metal was a gas station. I feel like I would see it, with the blackout baggings in gas station stuff, or back behind the counter of a gas station. No? Or maybe. Remember you used to be able to get magazines at gas stations? Remember that was like a place you would go to get your nudie mags?
I don't
so
remember
that's
the
where
blackout bags on Heavy Metal, although they definitely had suggestive covers, but I think they just had clear poly bags because Heavy Metal really lived and died on that logo and on the quality of the covers.
Well, I mean, no, maybe I'm thinking of how the racks they would be on would be like high rise to cover most of the cover except for the title, and you could just stick all the magazines in there, so you could only kind of read the title. You wouldn't really be able to see what the cover was. You know?
Right. Oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. You're at the convenience stores, the gas stations, where you'd have the lower sections that were more kid friendly, and the upper sections tend to have a higher like wooden barrier, and so you see the logos, and you have to you'd be highly visible, and you'd have to reach up to get that magazine and pull it out, and people could see you. You couldn't sneak it like we could sneak it off of the regular shelf.
Exactly.
It's not like it was ever racked next to the comic books, but it definitely wasn't racked in a high visibility section because there was a high priority magazine, and that's again part of I think what Heavy Metal lived for is being sneaky about some of the shit they were pulling.
So the next story we're introduced to is Den. You want to tell us a little bit about it, Frank?
Well, I'm curious. By the way, the last song on the Harry Canyon, which, by the way, I wonder if it's sort of like a Rusty Sanchez kind of thing, Harry Canyon. The last song is Heartbeat by Riggs, which definitely falls into the yacht rock category. It's kind of a forgettable one. Den is based on the character of the same name created by Richard Corbin. How much experience have either of you guys had with Corbin?
I met Heavy Metal Magazine. There's a lot of this shit in there.
Probably nothing for me. Sorry.
Would you recognize him if you saw his work?
I mean, I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah.
It's very distinctive.
Very, very distinctive, yeah. Because he dates back to, like, the fanzines of the 1970s. And he was a guy who, I mean, he definitely did painted work, but his work almost looked like CGI before CGI. He had this weird way of doing fleshes where they had sort of a plastic quality to it, but they still kind of seemed meaty. And, he was always drawing naked people. And Dan infamously was running around with his dick swinging around all the time. And in this case, Dan is like his
work.
Huh?
He did do some Marvel work. He did the Hulk.
Sure.
He did the last Punisher story.
Well, especially later in his career in the early 2000s, Marvel had their mature readers imprint called Max, and they took advantage of that. They had him do a really pretty racist Cage miniseries with Brian Azzarello.
Oh, yeah.
And as you said, he did some Hulk stuff, and he did a fair amount of stuff. Because I think what it was is I figure Quesada and Palmiotti, when they were still working together, I think they had sort of a Heavy Metal mentality, and they brought a lot of that stuff to the Marvel Knights work. And so you had guys like Milo Manata and Corbin getting work at Marvel for the first time in their careers to a large degree. Corbin was always, I think, too provocative for Marvel before then. But I guess in his career, he had that sort of respectability. Huh? Was that?
Did he ever do any DC work?
Not much DC work either. He was really more like Warren and Heavy Metal and
okay. Because I would love to see it as like Martian Manhunter or something like that.
He would have been interesting on his character like Martian Manhunter. That would have been a good fit. Except that I think I've seen more of the Manhunter that I'd wanted to see. But why don't you tell us about the story?
He did Meatloaf's Bat Out of Hell cover.
Did he? That wouldn't surprise me.
The fucking motorcycle flying off into space or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, I can vaguely picture it. It sounds about right. Both versions too, right? Because they had a similar artwork in the Bat Out of Hell 2 from the 90s.
Did they?
I think the artwork was fairly similar. Yeah. Or I think it was subtitled Back into Hell, and I think he's like a guy riding a bat into like a hellscape. That's.
You know what? I don't remember Bat Out of Hell 2. I only remember Bat Out of Hell 1, and that's the Corbin. I don't know if he did the second one. Maybe he did. Sure, I don't know.
So what's the story of Den?
Little nerdy kid finds a meteorite in his yard, forgets about it, starts doing some experiments with electricity, activates the Lochnar. Lochnar teleports him to another world where he went from this skinny little nerdy guy to this big ball. Let's say The Rock. Just say he looked like The Rock. Didn't look like The Rock.
That would be really good casting if that would ever
absolutely
come about. Yeah.
Except that means The Rock would have to walk. That means The Rock would have to walk out on screen with his dick swinging around. That's the only thing. Because that seems to be a running theme a little bit here. And he meets some British chick, saves her from this sacrifice, gets some action. He gets captured by these mutants, taken to a priestess who they take him to the guy who's against the priestess. It's just a planet of mutants and these two humans. I'm guessing humans are teleported to this planet from Earth, and the Lochnar gives them somewhat powers depending on who they are, or just the men, because I believe the women just have big boobs and that's it. the men, Den looks like The Rock, and the little guy looks like a David Spade or Andy Dick type character. More like Andy Dick.
Yeah, well, and definitely of ambiguous sexuality as well.
Yeah, so very Andy Dick. And so Den has to prove himself, kills some mutants. The little Andy Dick guy decides to tell him, I need you to get me the Lochnar, because they're obsessed with this Lochnar, because it's, some kind of...
Well, I think that you got two priests of different, of like cults that are against one another, and whoever gets the Lochnar is going to be the one who can open up the dimensions and control like the Lovecraftian creature that's eating the sacrifices and shit. So it's basically a power struggle based around the Lochnar and cults seeking it.
Yeah, but like the little guy is immortal. Den has been turned into The Rock. So they have powers. I don't know if the women got any powers.
Well, I think that no. The woman that Den hooks up with is just like Den. She's from our world, and she was not unlike the Den from our world, not a desirable example of humanity. Okay. Who then goes to the fantasy world and becomes a very desirable example of humanity, which is why they bone, because you have to. It's just the law. But she's totally getting off on the same way he is, because they're these Adonises and super babes and shit.
Yeah, and so the little Andy Dick guy tells The Rock that he needs to go get the Lochnar from the female priestess, and he sends them with Noro, one of his mutant men, and so they decide to go. And the artwork is absolutely stunning. It is a heavy metal comic book come to life.
Do you want to hear my note about the animation of this one? It says, the animation is as if every 80s and 90s indie comic came to life.
Yep, I agree with that. It's beautiful.
I would argue this probably has the best animation of the movie.
No.
You don't think so?
No way.
Okay.
No, man. So beautiful, so dangerous is the most. I think the nicest art style. This is very distinctive. I love the color palette. Like the earth tones are not just brown and brown. It's brown, reds, blues, green. It's very. It looks like one of his art pages. Yeah,
that's one of the things that bugs me is I really wish in the sequel to not to jump ahead, but I wish in the sequel they had a sequence where they did this in CGI, because Corbin, you could absolutely do Corbin style in computer animation and capture that essential quality to it. And usually when they try to do that stuff, it's terrible, and we all just ache for seeing what should be 2D animation done in CGI. But Corbin, it's the exact opposite. I ache to see that in CGI, and they've talked a bit about doing another heavy metal. They're trying to get financing, I think. And if they don't have a Corbin sequence with CGI, that would be a real disappointment to me.
Actually, my understanding is Love, Rocket, Death on Netflix?
Yeah.
Those are the children of heavy metal.
Yeah, no, David Fincher developed that as a heavy metal continuation, and the deal fell through, so he just released it on his own.
Yeah, but they had to rename it something else. But those are of the lineage of heavy metal.
Totally. I was about to say, as soon as you started saying it, I was like, oh, yeah, it's whatever it is, yeah.
Because when I watched those, I was like, oh, shit, I'm sorry, Heavy Metal 2 sucks ass. That fucking Fox shit is stupid. But when I love the first one, and when you watch that Netflix version of it, they go hand in hand. They're great together. It's just a continuation, a updated continuation of the story. Just a side note, I at one time almost had a chance to buy a animated Cell, and it's the scene with Den and the mutant, and I still kicked myself in the ass for not picking it up. The guy was going to sell it to me for $100 because I do collect some of these animation cells from that. I do have one from the Wizard, and some small Ewok, some bullshit ones, but the Wizard is the one from the Wizard. That's one of my prized possessions now. I still kicked myself in the ass because the guy was like, at the time, heavy metal wasn't that big. It was at a con, like this little con in a fucking Hilton hotel, and the guy's like $100, and I'm just like, nah, it's too much. Now, I kick myself in the ass every time I think about it.
I'm on a site that has animation cells, and the cheapest one from Den that he's selling is $300.
Yeah, that's not bad.
Yeah, it's not bad. I mean, it's not a great sell either. The better ones are, 500, 800, stuff like that.
Yeah, see, this one was actually Den, like the whole Den with the mutant next to it. So I was like,
oh, yeah. That'd definitely be more than $100.
Oh, yeah. So I'm sorry, Frank. Go ahead.
No, actually, you were still finishing up the story.
So Den is doing the trip, or The Rock is doing the job for Andy Dick. They go to the female version of Andy Dick, the Empress, and they capture Den and his buddies. She sees Den and immediately has to fuck him. And he's like, damn, on my planet, 18 years of nothing, and on this planet, twice in one day. So he's super proud of himself. Seduces her, bangs her. Turns out they steal the Lochnar. She blames Den, decides to try to kill him. He escapes. Again, art style, fucking, I don't see how y'all don't love this. Art style is so amazing. Den escapes, rides it. Turns out the little Andy Dick guy was going to sacrifice Den's girlfriend anyway. So the two mutant armies come together and start battling. The Empress is there. The Andy Dick guy is there. The little Andy Andy Dick guy's trying to sacrifice her. They throw her into the water. Den leaps in to save her. He did that at the beginning. He saves her. The two main cult leaders start battling. Den wraps a chain around this spear, throws the spear, it lands above them. Electricity strikes the spear, which then ignites Lochnar, and we're assuming teleports those two, the cult leaders, back to Earth. She tells Den, you could use the Lochnar to go back. He's like, fuck that. I'm hung like a monster. I'm hung like a mule here. I'm not going anywhere. And you could rule these people. And he's like, fuck that. They jump on a bug and fly away.
Yeah. Did you ever read the original comic book story this was based on, or any of the stories?
I would see some of the Den stuff. I think I own some of the Den stuff on some of the old heavy metal, which is crazy because I just went to a half-off bookstore not too long ago, and they had literally a shelf of just old heavy metal magazines, but they wanted like $8 to $10 a piece, and I'm like, fuck, I can't spend that. But I did look at some of the older ones. I just didn't have time. Dude, they must have had at least 40 or 50 of them, maybe 60 different books already bagged, and I would need to do a little research to see which older ones I need, because I do have quite a few of them now from the old days, and I am missing some gaps in my collection that I would like
I was saying too, there's such a prejudice against heavy metal magazine. You don't find them like back issues very often in comic shops, especially the older stuff.
Yeah,
they're not that easy to find on eBay,
really,
especially on good condition. So I would say probably $8 to $10 a piece if that's what it costs to get some of the older shit. It's probably worth it because it's really hard to fill out runs. I have a real interest. I like Jim Steranko despite his politics of the day, and I really would like a copy of his adaptation of Outland, the 80s Sean Connery movie, but you can't find that fucking thing without it being expensive as all hell. But that's if you can fucking find it. You're talking about like $80, $100, and especially a lot of those earlier 70s heavy metals, they're going to run you a pretty penny when you can find them at all. They're just not easy to come by. And also, I've been able to find some of this material on the internet. Like for a little while there, the Internet Archive had some copies of old heavy metals you could toss through. But like most of those scanning sites and shit, they don't have heavy metal either, especially not any kind of comprehensive selection. So a lot of times the only way you can read this shit is to get a collection or buy the original issues.
Yeah.
I just Googled Jim Steranko Outland. Holy shit, dude, it looks amazing.
Definitely one of the last great works he did. And obviously Sean Connery's a perfect subject for him.
Yeah, holy cow, this looks incredible. Anyway, I will say Den, in my notes, worst animation of the whole movie. It's all right. It was super bland, although it does have one of my favorite lines of the movie. When he first becomes Den and he's thinking to himself, he's like, I'm big. And he goes, no way I was going to walk around this place with my dork hanging out. And then somebody grabs a flag off the wall and he ties it around his waist. I think that's probably the first usage of dork instead of dick in pop culture. And I was pretty excited to hear that. I laughed out loud mightily at his dork hanging out.
I remember one of the Meatballs movies made a point of explaining what a dork was to one of the campers. So I'm not sure how the timeline works on that.
God, I laughed so hard.
Well, and it's worth noting, too, that this Den was voiced by John Candy. And probably the only time in his career he ever got to play that kind of heroic, male of that sort. And the amiable quality that John Candy lends the character gives you definitely feel for the guy. You root for him automatically just because it's John Candy's voice coming out of this gigantic body. But of course, in the original comic books, the dork does stay out the entire time. That dick is swinging around the whole damn series. But if you go back to the original story, it's actually a lot longer and darker. There's a back and forth between the different priests that isn't in the animation. At one point, there's a guy that the ambiguously sexual dude, like he steals his family to like coerce him into helping him, and it turns out like the family's already dead, and so he finds the bodies and he freaks, like they go from living to dead because he just like reanimated them to fuck the guy over, or just all this weird stuff going on. So they definitely lightened it up for heavy metal, and I imagine even though there's horror segments in the cartoon, overall the project is relatively light. It's violent, but thematically it's even when you've got like hot chicks getting melted, well fuck her, she's a bitch who's going to screw the guy over anyway, that kind of thing. They definitely shy away from some of the darker elements that you would have in heavy metal and the more cynical quality to it, even though that's still present here.
10-4.
My history of comics on heavy metal is pretty intensive, but I mean, I did read a lot of the comics and stuff like that in the magazines. But I mean, a lot of that stuff was like later in life. Do you know what I mean? Like I think the most real-time association I have with it was when they released the sequel with Julie Strain. That was back when I was in LA. So like I went to Golden Apple and got an autograph with Julie Strain, you know, when that came out, and I have the adaptation, you know, the one that Kevin Eastman, I think he did like the cover for. I think he did like the interiors for it too, or something like that, and she signed it for me and all that kind of stuff. So like that I remember getting in real time. But I think most of the other stuff, like, you know, the you know, a lot of it was me like just going through all these things, reading a lot of them either for the first time or picking up some threads of things. Because like when I did the video, it's like I remember I watched the first movie, I think when I was like 12 or 13 or something. Like my aunt probably shouldn't have showed it to me, but she did, because she forgot like there were boobies in it or some shit. I don't remember, but she showed it to me. And then after that I was like, oh boy, boobies, you know, like that was kind of my takeaway from that. And then I think when I was doing all the research for the video, like that's when I read a lot of the Mobius stuff and the Den, and that got me into like this weird track where I was reading. I read like a shit ton of Penthouse comics, because they had like that Den. I don't know if you call it a sequel, but like this kind of, you know, Den's brother, like Den or whatever the fuck it was. Like it was really weird. But like there were all kinds of other stuff where it was like Maguire and Bart Sears and all these guys were doing, Adam Hughes were doing all those weird sort of Penthouse comics stuff. So I was kind of morbidly, mildly fascinated with all of it. So I was reading the Den stuff for research, but then that was like one of the few things, like sometimes when I do research, then I get like sidetracked and I'm like, oh, this is interesting. And I just started reading like all the other stories, where before you know it, I'm reading Kevin Maguire stories about like Elvis and you know, I think the Adam Hughes thing, he didn't do that many issues, because I think eventually like his brother started drawing it or something. But there were just like a shit ton of stories where, you know, it just devolved into you know, Penthouse sexcapades, but with like, I don't know, like superheroes and different weird shit. So
yeah, I had a similar track. Is you know, I tossed through heavy metal on the stands oftentimes, but it didn't really make it home very often because I wasn't enough of a sci-fi guy, and when I would buy it and read it, I typically didn't really get into it that much. But I did pick up some of the Penthouse comics, and Fix-It's got, I think, a complete set of that series. George Caragone was spending so much money on that book to get like just the best freaking artist, to where if you can set aside that as porn and just buy it as comic art, murderer's row of talent in there. Mm-hmm. You know, Dave Johnson was doing stuff in there. I think Russ Heath did some stuff in there. Kevin Nolan did a bunch of stuff. I think he was doing the Scion strip in that one. You know, just glorious. I think Jason Pearson did some stuff in that. Mark Texeira did some painted work in that one. So, you know, I know that I'm sure a lot of people, they hear Penthouse and they know that there's sexual stuff in there, and so they might be averse to it. But if you're a comic art fan, it's really hard to turn that down just for the comic art alone. But me, I'm not averse to porn, so it's like, yeah, you know, double bonus, you know, good job. But that was one of the issues I had too, is heavy metal worked better for me as porn than it did as comics. And when I could get a hold of actual porn, that I had that much less interest in heavy metal. But knowing how important it is to Mr. Fix-It and his development and his tastes, I've subjected myself to those two movies and done research. And as you mentioned, like with Den, they actually, I think it was Fantico of all people, did a solo Den series that ran about 8 or 9 issues. That was very bizarre and got far away from the fantasy, power fantasy shit, the barbarian shit that would made it fun in the heavy metal. It got into more like a dystopian sci-fi thing and like body swapping and shit going on, and like, you know, his relationship with the female character from the strip, and I think she's supposed to have died, and just all this really dark, bleak shit. And I don't think it, and when the series finally ends, and I think that's probably around the time the company itself was starting to fall apart as well. They even say in the letters column, well, this was an interesting experiment, but if we ever come back and do more Den, it'll probably be close to what we were doing in Heavy Metal Magazine, which is what you guys wanted anyway. And for some reason, they did that book without any nudity. And like, it's sort of a hallmark of Den to have cocks flapping around and titties bouncing around and shit. And of course, to be in full color, and this was in black and white. It just seems like this weird misadventure, trying to do something using the Den branding without understanding what people were reading Den for. And I'm sure there are people who were buying it just because it's Corbin. But I do think there was a sort of a bait and switch where if you may be a Corbin fan and you may be a Den fan, but you're maybe not getting what you want from this particular title. And then as you're saying, he goes off and does the Penthouse Comics stuff. I'm sure for that money, want to rake in those dollars, but it definitely feels like that's a better vehicle for Den stories than this Fanico bullshit where they try to play it serious, and that part of the fun of Den seemed to me to be that it was a bit of a goof.
Yeah. That was, I think the only other thing I can point to, and it's not technically heavy metal, but I think the first time outside of seeing that heavy metal movie that I associated heavy metal with comics was when Byrne did that Critical Mass one-shot for Dark Horse, and he basically referred to it as his quote-unquote heavy metal story. So in some ways, I kind of feel like that was my first heavy metal comic, even though it has nothing to do with heavy metal.
Well, I think heavy metal is a state of mind, regardless of who's doing the actual publication. But I don't remember Critical Mass at all. That's a complete blind spot for me. I have no recollection of that at all. When was that?
It was back when they were...
I assume during the Next Men days, right?
Yeah, it was during the Next Men days. I feel like it was in between Next Men and Babe, or around that time frame. And so it was just this one shot. And it's kind of hard to describe, but it was basically Byrne doing enough said, where it was like the Snake Eyes silent issue. There was no dialogue. It was all art. If I described the story, it would sound kind of boring and stupid, but it's not. It was just it's like Spaceman shows up, but Spaceman is Human Man, takes off his spacesuit, is naked, comes across nubile young woman who's super sexy and naked, and they have sex, and everything's great. But then this gigantic alien monster craziness comes out. Spaceman, who is Human Man, freaks the fuck out. Is probably a metaphor for I'm scared of fatherhood or whatever. Runs the fuck away out of his spacesuit, never to return. And then you see at the end the woman's pregnant or whatever. But if I recall correctly, the crazy alien thing was not going to eat him. It was just hey, I think it was some guardian of the woman, or you know what I mean. It wasn't. Basically, it was all a big misunderstanding or whatever the fuck it was. But that was his heavy metal or whatever. I think in his they had the little letter column or whatever you want to call it, the editorial thing, and he kept describing it as his he's I always thought of this as my heavy metal story, but ultimately it was Dark Horse who published it because he was doing, like you said, the Next Men and the Babe and the Torch of Liberty and that kind of whatever, that Legendary imprint, it was right in the midst of all that stuff, and of course boobies and all that stuff that always stood out to me. So
did John Byrne ever have any kids? I don't think so, right?
I know
he was Kieron Dwyer's stepdad at one point in time.
That's the only thing I'm familiar with. I don't know, man. He seems like too much of a fucking asshole to have kids, but
right.
That's just me.
Well, but at least he's not enough of an asshole to have kids, though. So you got to give him some points for that. Knowing better than to do that.
He knows better than to have kids.
Was there any music in this one? Reach Out by Cheap Trick.
Yeah.
On to the next one.
So this would be Captain Stern, based on the character of the same name created by Bernie Wrightson.
Nice.
And my first exposure to Captain Stern, one of the early Dreadstar comics, I think it was the 6th issue, Plan M, I read it in the epic newsstand re-release called Dreadstar and Company. And because the story came up short, they ran this Bernie Wrightson Captain Stern short. And then again in the early 90s, I think it was Kitchen Sink Press did a bookshelf format miniseries collecting a lot of the old Heavy Metal strips. I don't think I've ever read the specific story being adapted in the cartoon, but I was definitely familiar with the character even before I ever saw Heavy Metal.
Why don't you tell us about this one, Matt?
Okay, basically, we're in space. We're in a space station. We're at a trial. Captain Lincoln F. Stern is on trial for all sorts of atrocities where they're like run down the counts, where it's like, you got 10 counts of piracy and 100 counts of rape and da-da-da-da-da. And
one moving violation.
Yeah, and one moving violation. So he basically goes, not guilty. Whatever, he pleads not guilty, all of them. And so then they call like a witness to the stand who you assume that he's bribed, or they talk about how he's bribed, and the dude's name's Hanover Fist. And he basically get it, Hanover Fist, everybody? Yeah. And instead of getting up there and talking about how, oh no, he's innocent, he didn't do any of this stuff, he starts like saying even worse shit that he did, right? And then I guess as he's doing it, he's getting more and more worked up until he hulks out into this giant...
Well, you forgot to mention that when Hanover is walking to the court, he finds the Lochnar rolling as a little marble.
Oh, is that... Yeah, that does happen, right? Yeah. Okay, I missed that part.
Because again, apparently the Lochnar can change sizes, or maybe each universe, the humanoids are different sizes, but it's a little marble that he bumps into and he finds it. So when he's walking to court, they call Hanover Fist. He goes up and he starts talking. He starts playing with the marble. And as he's playing with it, the Lochnar, I guess, starting to slowly give off its evil energy. And he starts, like you said, talking about all the other crimes. Because again, what he's being convicted of is like fraud and rape and murder, which is horrible. But then Hanover starts talking about like really fucked up shit that he's done, like even worse than that.
Yes,
because again, Captain Stern his whole defense is dependent on this one guy's testimony.
So, but as the dude hulks out, he just basically starts destroying everything in the space station, going after Stern. So Stern's basically, running from him. He's, people are dying left and right. Fucking walls are getting crashed through. And then he gets to where he corners him, and he's all hulked out. And Stern's like, "Good job, Hanover," or Mr. Fist. And then he hands him his part of the money. And when he does that, he kind of calms down, de-hulks out, turns back into Hanover Fist, and then Stern hits like a trapdoor under him, and he falls out of the space station. And the Fist and the Lochnar go plummeting towards Earth's atmosphere.
And then real quick, the attorney or the prosecutor is voiced by Dean Warner from Animal House fame.
Really? It says on Wikipedia, it says John Flannery does.
Really?
It's Charlie the lawyer. Joe Flatter.
Yeah, that would be Captain Stern's attorney, but the prosecutor.
Oh, my bad.
Yeah, there were a lot of SCTV guys doing voices for this. So I'm wondering if there was a Canadian production or something. One thing that only just now hit me is it's easy to go to the frame of reference of him hulking out like the Incredible Hulk. But what's funny is the Captain Stern story I read was in Dreadstar number 6. In issue number 5, it tells sort of the same story where Eddie and Schivo are getting chased around a building by a guy named Two-Ton that also hulks out and wrecks this complex and ends up seeming to perish when he goes out a window and falls to his seeming death. I wonder if maybe Starlin was inspired by the original Bernie Wrightson story, and of course they were buddies. One thing I like is I'm a much bigger fan of Wrightson as a horror guy. I'm not really into him doing humor type stuff, especially since he's basically doing like Brock. What's the name of the guy from Futurama? The captain guy?
Yes.
Yeah, that's basically who Captain Stern is. And so it's a humor story, but I think that the animation does a good job of capturing Wrightson's humor style. And while it's not my favorite medium for Wrightson's artwork, I very much prefer the horror stuff. I think they do a good job of looking like a Wrightson piece in the cartoon.
It does, but I still thought the animation was not as good as the rest of these stories, but better than Den. That's all. As far as creators go, who are some of the big creators to spy? I would assume it's a lot of British.
Inky Bilal.
Oh, yeah.
School.
Yeah, that's one of those ones that I would see advertised. I think that's one of the ones who's done a lot of stuff for humanoids. And I think that they also did a fair amount in heavy metal back in the 80s. But it never seemed like the ones that I got had Bilal artwork. So it was always like cool looking covers that were in like their back issues of their graphic novel advertisements, but not something I had firsthand experience with. Moebius.
Yeah,
Mobius.
I'm very familiar with him.
Very familiar with Mobius.
Actually, I just watched a documentary about him not too long ago.
I know I've mentioned it on the podcast before. Mobius did, of all fucking things, an Iron Man poster for fucking Marvel in either the early 90s or late 80s that is so weird and rad looking. And I think I've still got the poster somewhere in a closet somewhere.
Dude, how is that not framed?
Oh, if I find it, I'll frame it. I don't have a clue where it is. I have like a huge poster tube where I just like rolled all my posters up through time as tight as I could, one on top of the other. So I'd have to pull it out of the tube tube and unravel all of them to find it.
Oh, I'm in the same boat. I found my poster tube. Hey Frank, I still have that martial law poster game a long time ago.
Yeah, you mentioned that. Yeah, I would love to see that up someday.
I saw it. I'm like, I rolled it up immediately, put it back. I'm like, that's it. When I get a little money aside, I'm framing these pups.
Like right now on eBay, that poster's for sale for $200.
What?
The Mobius Iron Man poster, dude. It is so weird. I don't even remember where I got it from.
Yeah, it's so funny how ripped the Iron Man is. You know how organic he looks there.
Yeah.
Dude, Marvel Legends has to do a figure of that.
Oh, for sure. That'd be awesome.
I just remember Stan Lee was a huge fan of the artist and sought him out for that Silver Surfer graphic novel.
Yes,
and I think that went a long way toward legitimizing with American audiences that, like, this is the one guy that Stan Lee really wants to work with late in his career.
Oh, he did a Silver Surfer one that's really cool, too.
Mm-hmm. I remember that one.
Not demanding the price that the Iron.
That's a $200 poster? That's crazy, dude.
I mean, it's listed for $200. I don't know if someone's buying. Listen, I guess he did like a whole series of them because there's a Daredevil one. Looks like this is a Punisher one that maybe it's like obviously Mike Zeck influenced. Like he must have just got some Zeck materials. Like, oh, cool, I'll do a poster. Anyway, I don't have a lot of Mobius experience. I know who Mobius is, but not a lot of experience other than owning a really random Iron Man poster.
Luis Royo.
So yeah, this is the shit. Whenever I think of heavy metal, this is the dude. This is it right here.
This is the one that I would see on the back covers where they're selling print.
Well, and also he did a lot of the front covers. Yeah, and same boat for me. For me, Luis Royo is heavy metal. All of my favorite heavy metal covers. If it wasn't him, he was among the top favorite ones for me. I just love his artwork, and I so associate with heavy metal. And again, he's the one who did the cover of my favorite issue. Aspiri, Alfonso Aspiri specifically.
Okay, yeah, I used to see look familiar.
I remember seeing his artwork, his graphic novels on for sale, but I don't have very much experience with his artwork.
Like fantasy elf shit. I mean, I never bought any of it, but I recognize it through flipping through stuff.
Yeah, that Lorna character was in a lot of issues of heavy metal. I like his style okay, but it's not really to my taste broadly, so not one of my favorites, but one that I would definitely see in collections, so helping to be an ambassador to the brand, I would say, since there were a lot of collections by that artist. He did a lot of low-key erotica type stuff, too. Kaza?
Who?
Bless you. No. I feel like that moth-winged chick looks familiar. Maybe?
This does not look familiar to me at all.
I'm gonna
Philippe Drouet.
Maybe.
No.
Is that Vader? This looks very Star Wars. Yeah, that's Star Wars, right?
Probably.
Death Star.
Yeah.
I am not familiar with this artist. Very cool looking, though.
Definitely another one of those ones that I would see in collections and stuff, but didn't really resonate with me.
Looks like a Giger take on
No, do you remember one time we went to that? I don't know if you were with us, Mac. We went to this shop that sold posters, like those actual posters, the old school posters, and he had a bunch of posters from like Europe where they would do their own interpretation of the movie.
The Retro Art Gallery.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of my favorite places.
Because I remember I was gonna buy that Planet of the Apes one.
I think Frank and I had many conversations. So basically, with people, if you're actually still listening to this podcast, it was a company that all they did was specialize in old movie posters, old propaganda posters, like tobacco and chewing gum and Goodyear tires or rubber, and it was from all throughout time, from all over the planet. So like Japanese Star Wars posters, just to keep it nice and nerdy. But they also had like Le Mans racing posters and all these crazy like Polish. Wasn't there some Polish artists?
Yeah.
I feel like all the Polish versions of movie posters were some of the craziest shit ever.
Oh yeah, they were fucking bizarre as shit. Because they're like, he'd be like, "What movie do you think this is?" And it's like this fucking dude with a shotgun in his mouth and this and that. And it's like, "Oh, this is It's a Wonderful Life." I'm like, "What?"
Yeah,
it was their
super
interpretation of the movie. Yeah,
but they were like original. And these weren't like reproductions. These were the original ones, and some of them were like 20 feet high, or maybe not that, maybe like 15 feet high. And you had to get them to come help you like go through them and stuff. And none of us had any sort of funds to purchase any of these things, so we were basically in there just keeping them busy. And they were like, "Yeah, you guys aren't gonna actually buy shit." And then they eventually, I think they ended up closing the place and just taking it all online because I felt like they sold most of their stuff online anyway, or to people overseas anyway, so they didn't really need a physical location, which sucks because I love to go there and just waste time. But
I remember one time because I wanted to buy that Planet of the Apes poster that was so weird, the Ukrainian one, and the guy kind of talked me out of it. He's like, "This is an investment." Like, this isn't like you're just not gonna put tack and put this on the wall. This is because it was a big poster too. It must have been at least like 5 feet tall, like long wide. And I remember thinking, it's pretty big. And I remember Pussycat was there with me, and I was really interested in it. But the guy pretty much like talked me out of it because it was quite expensive.
So just to give you guys an example, we're talking about. Just go look up the Polish version of the Alien movie poster, and this is what we're talking about. Where it's just art. It has nothing to do with the actual movie. They didn't even show. They probably just gave the artist like a synopsis of what the movie's about and told them to just make a movie poster. But artistically, the poster is incredible. It looks amazing. But for you to have guessed that it's the movie poster for Alien, there's no way. You would never do that unless you spoke Polish or something, or read Polish.
That's Arthur Saddam.
Looks cool. Looks very heavy metal.
Charlie a Flytrap.
And of course, he does all the zombie posters now and stuff. Now, you read some of the Charlie and Flytrap stuff, though, right?
Fuck yeah, I love that shit back in the day. And again, most of that you found either in Epic magazine or was it Heavy Metal? I think that was in Epic, wasn't it?
He did both, as I recall.
But I want to say I think I read most of his stuff in the Epic magazine.
Boris Vallejo?
Yeah, of course. I know Boris, but not from Heavy Metal. I know him from doing like trading cards and shit like that from Marvel.
Surely Fix has got something to say about Boris.
Boris, I mean, I always saw his post. I don't think I've ever. Actually, I think I do own one of his art books, though.
Yeah, you gave me one of his art books. You gave me one of his art books.
Oh, did I? I think I have another one. I think at one time I was buying those books.
I always prefer, obviously, I think Frank Frazetta is like the godfather of painted fantasy shit. Absolutely. Boris is good. I always preferred him to like Julie Bell. Who are the like brothers or something?
No, Julie Bell is his wife. She's from Beaumont, by the way.
Yep.
Not unlike Janis Joplin, also from Beaumont.
Really? Julie Bell's from Beaumont?
Yeah, right? Weird, right?
That's random. Yeah, but what were the Hildebrand? The Hildebrand
brothers. Yeah, they did a fair amount of heavy metal covers as well. But later in the 90s, I think, though.
They're last place for me of all these mainstream painted fantasy artists.
Yeah, I never liked all those autumnal colors and way too much in the fantasy, bullshit, dwarves and all that kind of stuff.
I thought they look rubbery, too.
Yeah.
Or kind of slightly glossy or sweaty or something.
Yeah. I love Boris and Julie. Obviously, the emphasis is going to be on Boris because he did so many fantastic covers in the 70s and 80s, like paperback novel covers. One of my favorite books growing up was The Girl Who Owned a City. He did the cover for that. He did a lot of movie posters that I dig on. I really love his style, and Julie Bell is obviously hugely indebted to his style, but I really like her stuff too. I thought she was better at doing the superhero type stuff. She had that more classical superhero anatomy, and she was good at doing the shiny metals more so even than Boris. I love them both. I really enjoy their artwork, but it seems like their profile diminished greatly in the 2000s, which is a shame, but I definitely enjoy their work, and I'm always happy to look through their art books. I dig them.
Are you sending more?
Daniel Torres.
No familiarity.
He was definitely one of those guys who would be doing like the thieves running across a Moroccan rooftop kind of stories that I wasn't really down for. It just wasn't really to my taste, but I appreciated it being in there because he had his own distinctive style. There was a lot different than anybody else in Heavy Metal magazine, so I appreciated that at least. Milo Manara.
No familiarity, but this looks dope. Looks awesome.
Surely Fix-It knows him at least, right? Milo Manara, Milo Manara.
Oh, yeah. I own some of his books. Yeah, of course.
Yeah. A few years ago, re-recorded a segment that I don't know, A, I misplaced, and B, I ended up not using, where the internet had decided to take him to task for how he drew Spider-Woman on a cover. And you had these fucking morons who were trying to explain to Manata how to draw the female form when he's a fucking master of it. And I had a frothing at the mouth, angry retort to that. And then I remember that he also did a lot of rapey stuff, a lot of stories where consent was very muddy at best. And I'm like, you know what? Maybe I don't want to put my neck out quite so far, but I think that he is one of the truly great artists in the history of comic books. I love his stuff. It's beautiful. It's deeply erotic. Very few people can draw a woman as well as he does. Just gorgeous, gorgeous work. And of the various artists associated with Heavy Metal magazine, he's one of the ones I've collected the most extensively. I will buy, like, the Dark Horse did a series of collections of his work. And he's, of course, worked with some famous filmmakers and done numerous graphic novels that aren't necessarily erotic, although that's his primary interest. And it still irritates the hell out of me. This is an instance where, as liberal as a guy as I am, I really do hate the fucking PC police driving him away from doing those Marvel covers that he was doing, because I think it's just exceptional work. And if you don't like how he draws a lady's butt up in the air, well, don't buy that fucking variant cover. Shut the fuck up. Who fucking asked you?
Yeah.
Funny note on that. It sold for $37,500. That original cover.
I totally fucking dig that cover, and it made me want to read that series. But then they turned around and gave her some shitty costume with like a jacket and made her look all practical, like she was from fucking Project Rooftop or some shit, and just completely killed the buzz. And then most recently they did a new Spider-Woman series where they gave her this all mostly black outfit that looked like fucking shit. And Dave Johnson designed it. Usually I like Johnson's stuff, but it's like there's nothing wrong with the costume, guys. You need to figure out how to make people give a shit about the character. The costume I think looks great, and especially when you got a great artist, drawing it. She doesn't have to be a sex pot, but it don't hurt either.
Cover's rad. He's dope.
Rowena?
No.
I wanted to get a little female representation in there, and I thought she'd probably be good after I knew that I was going to be talking up Manara. But she was one of the generic fantasy artists. She did a lot of heavy metal covers, but it wasn't one of the ones that ever really resonated that much with me. Peter Cooper.
No.
Nope.
He's a guy I associate more with like, the New Yorker, kind of like a high-end type of work. Well, obviously much more abstract. I like his stuff fairly well, but it was definitely the artsier side of heavy metal when he would appear in it. And I think he appeared more in the latter days, like the 2000s or so. Paul Kirchner.
This looks familiar.
Yeah, I was going to say, same for me. It looks familiar, but I couldn't place it.
I like his stuff. Not one of the more famous artists, though. I've got some of his books. Haven't read too many of them. I think he's like a libertarian or something, too. But I really like that clean, clear art style of his.
I think he's like a libertarian.
So that somehow affects his artwork, or?
Well, it helps if I like a person's politics as well. But here's Guido Crepax.
I've seen that, but
He did an adaptation of Emmanuel, and given that I have a strong interest in that film series and the book, I should have a copy of that. But his style just never really worked that great for me. It's really European, but it's like he does a lot of erotica that I don't find be particularly erotic, and just not enough detailing for my taste. So we associate very strongly with heavy metal and that type of book, but I've never been a huge fan of his work specifically. Pepe Moreno.
No.
Nada.
I think he's got a nice style, but I think for the most part he's just known for the one strip Rebel, which was always being advertised in graphic novel form in the heavy metals when I was reading it in the 80s and 90s, but not a huge amount of familiarity with his work.
Yeah, I think it definitely looks cool, but I'm not familiar with any of it.
Yeah.
Sir Piri.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I owned a bunch of this shit. All the art books and stuff. It's fucking weird.
Yeah, I remember you being a big fan of his cross-hatching, and I think that he was probably a pretty big influence on Frank Cho.
I think it looks cool. Not sure I've seen it before, but I like it.
I know I've sold Fix-It some Druna volumes for sure. I remember that well.
Yeah.
I wish you would have sold me some.
Liberatore.
Yeah. It's that Android guy, right?
Ranxerox. At least they used to be called that before the Xerox Corporation got upset with them, and so I think they just call it like Ran or X or some shit now.
Are you serious? Oh man. Thanks a lot, Xerox.
It was one of those painted art styles that was so far in advance of anything I'd seen as a reader that it was like I couldn't comprehend how you'd gotten those kind of flesh tones and stuff in painting. So I really was super interested in it. And then a few years ago, Dark Horse was going to finally collect the entire series of stories that had run in heavy metal. And of course, I'd always seen it advertised in graphic novel form. And then again, I think it was the Internet Archive. I went to go check it out and flip through it and realized serious fucking pedo-ephebo stuff going on in there. And it's like, I don't want to have this in my house. I'm going to get arrested. I don't want this shit getting mailed to me. So as much as I love the art style, I've never properly read it and I can't own it. So I probably never will, because you can go to some places that you could get away with in the Taxi Driver, Jodie Foster days of the 1970s that you really don't want to be around in the 20,000s,
Yeah, these couple panels you sent over look really cool.
Olivia de Berardinis, although thankfully she mostly goes by Olivia.
Yeah, I own a bunch of her, I think a card set of her stuff.
I think I remember the card set. Yeah, I think I I know Olivia. She's pretty famous, right?
Yeah, she did a lot of the heavy metal, either the magazines or the specials around the time that I was most interested in the magazine, the late 80s, early 90s. And so with between her and Luis Arroyo are the two artists that I most associate with heavy metal. And of course, hardly anybody draws women as beautiful as either one of these artists, but Olivia became quite famous for it. And of course, she's a huge influence on other artists I love, like Joe Linsner. So yeah, there's always a place in my collection for an Olivia book, or I'm always happy to see her do a cover or something like that. Just extraordinary artist and a highly influential one as well.
She did lots of like Betty Page stuff, right?
Yeah. Along with Dave Stevens, she's one of the artists that really helped to popularize Betty Page after she'd been forgotten for a few decades there.
Word.
Juan Jimenez.
No.
No. Definitely looks giggerish to me.
Yeah, of the sci-fi stuff that heavy metal did, this was probably one of the prototypical styles, and obviously extremely detailed and very attractive. My problem is that he mostly worked with Jodorowsky, whose work I've generally avoided. It never really resonated with me. I know Siskoid's a fan, but I never really followed it that much. And also, so much of this was released through Humanoids rather than through heavy metal. And I just, they do either graphic novels or they do comic book sized publications, and it just never was something that I gravitated toward. I just don't have a lot of this stuff around, and so I don't have a lot of exposure to it. The artistry, I think, is amazing, and I think you can definitely see where this person would have had influence on guys like Travis Charest, who I'm a fan of, and who also worked with Jodorowsky. But I just don't have a lot of experience with it, but definitely very much in the heavy metal vein, I think.
Bisley? I remember a lot of Bisley stuff.
That was more the 90s, but yeah.
All right, next we have Neverwhere-Land. No? Wait, no. That was
So at the very end, you're correct. He opens the trap door. He falls through the trap door. The Lochnar starts talking about, kind of going into the next story, and you see Hanover's hand with the marble in it as it's burning, and then we're introduced to what is it, a B-52?
B-17. Okay, so I said Neverwhere-Land because I'm looking at the Wikipedia. Neverwhere-Land says because of time constraints, a segment called Neverwhere-Land, which would have connected Captain Stern to B-17, was cut. Story follows the influence of the Lochnar upon the evolution of a planet, from Lochnar landing in a bottle of water, influencing the rise of the Industrial Age. No, never.
Okay, if you have the VHS, it is on the extra. Is it the VHS or the DVD? One of them does have it as an extra feature, and it's all done in like ballpoint pen art style.
Oh yeah, I see the ballpoint pen stuff on YouTube. They've got it. That's pretty cool. Yeah, it is a very ballpoint pen on like construction paper, almost like the animated storyboards, kind of in a way. It's on YouTube, so you can watch it.
Very cool looking. Yeah, I remember hearing about it, never saw it, but you're correct. For time restraints, they took it out, and I did watch the special features. I mean, it's amazing because it is through ballpoint, and it's just a cool style, but it doesn't really take anything out of the story, I don't think.
Yeah, I guess it was supposed to bridge the gap between the two. Okay, so the next we got B-17.
How about we let Frank discuss this one?
This one's pretty straightforward. So the animatics you talked about were by Cornelius Cole III, and that was very much like one of those silent stories I was talking about earlier from the magazine. So it's a shame it wasn't in there, but the B-17 isn't that far off. There's a little bit of dialogue, but mostly it's set apparently in World War II. You got a fighter plane that's almost his entire crew has been wiped out. There's only, I think, the pilot and one man still left. And so the guy's going through and inspecting, the damage that's done and if anybody has survived. And unfortunately, the Lochnar then arrives to reanimate the corpses, which then do what corpses tend to do and attack
well, there's zombies.
Yeah, there's zombies, yeah. And ultimately, the plane crashes. The pilot, I think, survives. It was the pilot that survives. He finds himself, I'm assuming this is sort of like a Bermuda Triangle kind of situation. So he gets out, I think he parachutes out of the plane, he lands on an island, and he finds himself in an airplane graveyard, which is all together manned by more of these zombies that creep up on him to kill him. And there is one song in that segment, it's a fairly brief segment, called Heavy Metal, Taking a Ride. That's Don Felder. Also a pretty damn cool tune. tune. Both of the tunes with the title Heavy Metal are pretty damn cool. But I would say this is the lesser of the two.
Now, is this also, this is rotoscope, right? At least the plain portions are.
I honestly would say that most, if not all, of the movie is rotoscope. It's just that you've got like the opening sequence during the credit sequence. I think that might actually be literal photography that's been altered and animated. Whereas this is clearly they've animated over live action actors to give it that fluidity. I think pretty much all the movie is rotoscoped, or at least large portions of it, I would assume, because it was a common practice in the day. And this was not like a well-known animation house. Now to think about it, I do think they were probably Canadian. So almost certainly they were using rotoscope, which some people would argue is a cheat, but I don't think you get that nearly as much these days, especially with, CGI. There's a way bigger cheat when the animation is done through math as opposed to actually having to do it by hand. So I think there's a lot bigger allowance for rotoscoping now, and it's less of for a long time they were in 2D animation, it was like a dirty secret. Like nobody wanted to cop to it because it's like they were cheating. Whereas I love rotoscoped animation, especially when it's done right. Bakshi is one of the best at that. Whereas this one feels more like traditional animation. And if you told me it was traditional, I would have believed you, but I'm also perfectly willing to think that it was rotoscoped as well.
It's totally rotoscoped, dude. You're great. Yeah. I mean, no, it's this whole movie's rotoscoped. It to some extent. No,
So Beautiful is Dangerous is not. Tarna is not.
Tarna has got to be rotoscoped. Are you kidding me? Tarna's rotoscoped, man.
She's rotoscoped, dude.
You think so?
Yes, they're just drawing over an actress running. That's what it is. Now, like, obviously the backgrounds aren't rotoscoped, right? They didn't actually like film a Fantasyland and then color over it with fucking pencils. But it's rotoscoped.
All matte paintings anyway, weren't they?
Oh, who now? What?
Weren't most of the backgrounds matte paintings anyway?
Yeah. Because especially confirmed by the site that I see selling the animated cells, like most of it is just like a figure, right, with no background. It's because they laid it over the.
A lot of that stuff is like that.
Yeah, but the figures are all rotoscoped. The people in all of these cartoon segments are rotoscoped because they kind of move in that semi-slow motion. You know what I'm saying? Like that, all rotoscope kind of looks like it's slow motion in a way. No, doesn't it?
Well, I don't know. If you watch Fire and Ice, it definitely has a fluidity to it.
I think what Fire and Ice next to Walt Disney is probably the best rotoscoping ever used in animation.
The what now?
Well, if I recall correctly, Walt Disney used rotoscope for stuff like Snow White.
Well, yeah, like Snow White dancing. Yeah. They're dancing.
Yeah, but I would say Fire and Ice probably did it better than probably anybody this side of Disney, and maybe even better than Disney did it. Fire and Ice, the fluidity of the animation is so beautiful and graceful. Whereas with something like this, I think what Mac's catching on to is they're probably doing stuff like loops, where it's just like a small sequence of live action that's being animated, or they're just taking shortcuts and not using as many frames per second. And so you don't have that same level of fluidity, but you do have a movement that you wouldn't have conjured up purely from your imagination. That's a movement that looks human enough to where you figure they're probably just painting over photos of humans or cells of humans.
So okay. I thought B-17 didn't have like the best animation in the movie, but I thought the subject matter was more interesting. I liked what they did with the airplane. I feel like inside the airplane there was way more hatching and detail in it because it was a smaller space. So I approved of the animation in B-17.
And it's the simplest of all the stories.
Well, I know, but again, they put a ton of detail into the airplane because that's all they had to do, right? Yeah. It was just inside an airplane. So I appreciated the detail.
Heavy Metal Magazine, I think when it was first created, it was actually National Lampoon. Do you guys even, like, I know Pixar was the movie. Do you guys remember magazines?
I remember those magazines.
Not I.
So, National Lampoon was, not only was it a comedy magazine, I mean, if you're familiar with the basic history of the National Lampoon, it's a spin-off of the Harvard Lampoon. It was basically this editorial group at Harvard University that specialized in comedy and typically, I don't want to say lowbrow, but definitely a more boundary-pushing humor. And eventually, after these guys graduated, after they'd been doing like a newsletter on the campus, they actually had a proper syndicated magazine that would have editorials and political commentary and, anything that would be of interest to like a young man and a person who was interested in the worldly things, but but seeing it from a humorous slant. And because of the popularity of the magazine, they eventually spun off into making movies, and that's where you get things like Animal House and National Lampoon's Vacation. You know, there's this close association between the type of humor you would see in National Lampoon and like Saturday Night Live, which is sort of a hybrid of Monty Python and National Lampoon. And that's why a lot of those guys end up being in those movies and such. So again, kind of a snapshot of its time of baby boomers coming of age, being more libertine than the older generations, and maybe mixing, suggestive humor with politics and movie reviews and all that kind of good stuff. And one of the most famous covers was the one where you've got a Magnum
pointing the gun at
the dog. Yeah, buy this magazine where you shoot the dog, something like that.
Yeah, I remember seeing about that.
And what I think about too is we just recently were talking about how the Kentucky Fried Movie was recently streaming on what was it, Peacock?
Amazon Prime's got it.
Was it Amazon?
No,
Prime?
Amazon.
Okay, and I watched it up to the Fistful of Yin, and then I'll probably go back to it later on. And I watched with the girlfriend just to see how she'd react. She left almost immediately, and a lot of it was making fun of like Mandingo movies and lots of gay panic jokes and lots of TNA. Just that kind of humor was definitely a reflection of what you were seeing in things like National Lampoon. Whereas very much, especially young boomer men who either had maybe they didn't become hippies, but they were definitely more libertine, and they enjoyed this esoteric mix in their humor, and they liked it to be a little saucy.
Yeah. When did Kentucky Fried Movie come out? Probably around the same time, right? Late 70s, early 80s, something like that. Am I wrong?
I don't know. I only saw the movie because Frank recommended it to me. I remember you brought it up one time to me, and I was like, I've never seen a movie. And you told me to watch it, and I think I caught it on cable one time, and I'm just like, wow, this is
77 was Kentucky Fried Movie.
Yeah, I saw that in the late 80s on the movie channel. They used to run a lot of I don't think it was Joe Bob Briggs because he tended to focus more on horror stuff, but I think it was one of those hosted I don't know if it was a hosted program or not, but they tended, particularly the movie channel, would do like weird stuff and provocative stuff, especially in late night. And so that was my exposure to Kentucky Fried Movie, I think. Either that or it was an early video store rental, one of the two.
Mine was a combination of two. I think I saw it on TV and was like, oh, that's funny, except of course it's like heavily edited. So then I rented it from the video store, and of course it's like not rated or whatever, but I rented it anyway. I had a few not rated rentals that made impressions on me as a kid. But and I was like, whoa, there's like nudity in this movie, and it was like, extremely raunchy and sophomore humor and stuff. And
wasn't there another one similar to that called like Amazon Women from the Moon or something?
Yeah,
that was about a decade later, but it wasn't nearly as good, and it wasn't nearly as insane either.
The other not rated movie I bought thinking it was something else was The Toxic Avenger, the live action one. That I was like, oh,
I rented that. I remember renting that and enjoying it quite a bit.
Yeah, me too.
That was another
was it like Nuclear High or something? They're in the movie.
Say that again.
They had another movie like Nuclear High or something like that.
Well, I remember that, like, what do you call it? Because the Toxic Avenger, gets all mutated. Or was it the Toxic Crusader? There was the cartoon The Crusader, and the movie was Toxic Avenger?
The movie was the Toxic Avenger, and the cartoon, short-lived, was the Toxic Crusaders, if I remember correctly.
So I liked the cartoon, so I thought the movie was going to be like the cartoon, and instead, it's like, it's got nudity and stuff in it. But because there's like the scene where, because he meets up with that blind chick, and the blind chick doesn't like judge him because she's blind. You know what I'm saying? And then at some point that
Alicia Masters action.
Is that who that was? They have relations and there's nudity in it, and I was like, whoa, this is way better than the Toxic Crusader. I was like, where's my mom?
I want to say that was one that I caught on the movie channel too. I think that was one of those late night weirdo movies that they would run. I think they ran the first couple of them. I never saw Class of Nukem High. I'm familiar with it vaguely.
Yes,
I would catch bits of Surf Nazis Must Die. All that trauma shit was very much in the same vein as Heavy Metal, but of course they didn't have the unlimited budget that the comic book provided, but very much in that same vein of violent and transgressive storytelling.
And if I remember correctly, we rented the movies, and it was one of those things where we went to a place and it was like, so-and-so recommends this movie, and that's why I saw a lot of these movies. They had like the little recommendations, and that's where the Toxic Avenger and all those movies I was exposed to. So.
Well, yeah, if you went to the proper library, you and I might have even gone to the same library fix it, but they'd have those movie guides, like Joe Bob Briggs had a movie guide that it was rated on a scale of like number of boobs and number of deaths, or you'd have like the Psychotropic guide. There was all those weird gonzo type of movies that again hit perfectly for feral Gen Xers and boomers and such.
Another movie that falls in this category that I accidentally rented was the 1987 thriller Black Widow, because the cover was just black and it just said Black Widow on it. I don't know if this was a Blockbuster or maybe Hollywood or something. I can't remember. And I started watching it and I'm like, oh, this has nothing to do with like the comic character or anything like that. It was like this movie.
Wasn't that like Deborah Winger or some shit? Because I had the exact same reaction. I kept wanting it to be related to the comic book in some way, and of course it never was. That's how fucking desperate we were back in the 70s and 80s, where it's like, just because you used a title that's associated with a comic book thing, you're like, is this a comic book thing? Is this a comic book thing? It's like, no, it's a fucking like noir thriller and shit. But I never saw it, but I remember looking at that box to make sure there was no Marvel connection back in the day. Like 87, I think that was.
Yeah. 87, Deborah Winger and Teresa Russell.
Oh, well, Teresa Russell, I definitely know that there were boobies in that then, right?
I want to say there was, but I think that one might have been like the Toxic Avenger could keep my attention as a kid, whereas this one was like, what, it was some fucking thriller or some shit. I was probably like, next, turn it off. I'm gonna watch Ninja Turtles. I'm watching Ninja Turtles.
I remember going to the video store and being introduced to Tino Brass films, and that was have y'all ever seen Tino Brass films?
Oh yeah, I've seen some of the ones you've lent me. In fact, I think you gave me a copy or two of those.
Yeah, those things. I just remember we were talking about the video store. It was a magical place where Discovery was around every corner. I miss those places.
I know. I've talked a lot about how we almost never had cable, but we had to have had it enough, because that type of stuff I would have seen a lot on cable, and especially once we had VCRs, I'd have been taping some of that stuff. I still have copies on VHS of like Girls Without Lovers and shit like that. You know, those softcore European imports. And see, again, that's part of the fun of heavy metal, is not only did you have like the sci-fi boobies in the stories, but they always had advertisements for other stuff that you had to mail order, and some of that stuff was almost invariably either a softcore porn or actually full-on porn, especially once it got into the 90s. And so you could kind of get off on seeing the little tiny, you know, literally like postage stamp size images of erotica that was very much in that vein of Tinto Brass.
Well, it's just so weird thinking about this, because I still remember. Do you remember the first pornographic comic book you bought?
The funny part is, as far as like truly pornographic comic book, I didn't buy it. My mother bought it and I stole hers.
That's the most frank shit I've ever heard in my life.
Oh, dude, that's ultimate frank right there.
Yeah, because like occasionally there would be those magazines that were just collections of like the one-page gag strips that you'd have in adult magazines. You know, it was a full-page illustration in color, and then they have like a little written gag at the bottom of it. And so my mother would pick those up from the gas station on occasion, but specifically one of the only times I got to the real Third Planet, the one downtown, or not downtown, it's like Midtown, right? We got there once, and they had copies of Cherry Pop-Tart. And I don't know what possessed her to pick that up, but she picked that up and a few others. And I think my stepfather at some point bought some as well. So they would get it, they'd read, they'd toss through the one time, they'd be done with it, and I'd sneak in there and steal that shit. And I still think I have one or two of those left over after all these years.
I still remember going to a comic shop, and someone, I guess, had grabbed it and then tossed it on top of the book, and it was a copy of two girls, hot night, two hot girls, or something like. It was something weird like that. And the guy, I remember I put it in my stack of comics. I'm just like, maybe he won't even notice. Like, I could just kind of get away with it. And I always remember he looked at me, he looked at it, and he's like, and he just kept going, like, no big deal, dude. Didn't even faze him.
I did that one time at the flea market shop. Is they'd gotten a few adult books in. This would have probably been like early 90s, okay? And I had a good rapport with the girl who worked there. She kind of looked like Tracy Bonham, the singer. And so I'm like, okay, I'm gonna try this. I'm gonna try to sneak this through.
Maybe it was Tracy Bonham.
Maybe, yeah, she hadn't broken out yet. And so there's an issue of Ramba, which was, I think, an Italian magazine about like an assassin who typically got around to fucking people before she killed them. And so that's how I snuck out that one issue of Ramba, was just like kind of worked in with the other, action-oriented books. And either she didn't know better, or I kind of think she did, and she just like let me slide because, teenage boy, give me a break.
I want to say mine, I think, was like a Clive Barker's Nightbreed issue or some shit.
That was your porn? That explains so much about you right now.
No, definitely not. No, definitely. Dude, I had a buddy of mine who had his mom let him have a Playboy subscription. So I wasn't looking for comics with nudity in it, bro. That's the whole moral of the story. But I think the first issue, like an actual comic book that I saw with boobs in it, was like Clive Barker's Nightbreed.
Oh, dude, we've all come across those fucking boxes in parking lots full of fucking torn up, worn out porn. That's nothing new. But I'm like actually buying a pornographic comic book from a shop, because I was underage at the time. I was underage, and I remember thinking like, I was just like, fuck it, I'm just gonna go for it. Like, what is it saying? Fortune favors the bold.
Yeah, it's a rite of passage to nut up and actually walk up to a counter with something you know you're not supposed to have, you know you're not age appropriate for, and try to get away with that shit. It's like the first time you try to buy beer when you're underage, you know?
And the crazy thing was, I was 25 cents short, and the guy was like, you're 25 cents short, and I'm like, fuck. So I had to go out and ask my family member who's waiting in the car that gave me a ride to the shop if they could loan me a fucking quarter. I remember that.
I've got a nut riding on this, Mom.
Mom, you don't understand. No. You'll be able to keep your Sears catalog if I can have 25 cents. Holy shit.
But again, we're getting back to a classic time that I don't think is replicated anymore. You'll remember, and boys and girls both did this, is somebody would go dumpster diving and find, strip cover magazines and stuff, or discarded porn, and the whole group would get together out in the woods somewhere, or on the back behind the apartment complex and shit, and look through the girly magazines. Boys and girls, because we were all curious about this shit. And again, it was manna from heaven. We didn't have, especially if we didn't have cable, and especially poor kids didn't happen to have a lot of cable. So you'd have this crusty, water damaged, sometimes it was individual pages. It wasn't even an entire magazine. And everybody would be flipping through it just because we didn't know this shit. And it was like natural exploration. It was the only avenue to find stuff like that.
Yep.
He said water damaged, folks. He said water damaged. Dude. Or you'd find where I was up in northern Arizona, it was extremely wooded, right? So you'd just be cutting through the woods because you wanted to get from one place to another without walking down the street, and you'd run across a homeless, where they'd slept there that night, and there'd usually be a couple fucking magazines there or whatever. All sorts of random places you'd find this shit. We did not steal porn from homeless people, but whatever.
They would just leave it. They were nomads. But Hobo got a nut too.
We were picking up a litter. Helping the environment. I remember another time I was walking home from school, and there was some torn up magazine on the ground. I picked it up, and it was straight up porn. Somebody had got busted with some, and their mom had either cut it up or they were trying to dispose of it and then threw it out the window. And there was literally every 5 feet I walked, there was another part of a page. And I was like, I guess I'm collecting these today. More cleaning up the environment.
Best jigsaw puzzle ever.
Yeah. The story makes no sense, but I'm into it.
I always remember when I had a friend that her mom had a waterbed. Do you remember the old waterbed, Frank?
Oh boy, do we all have nightmarish stories of the waterbeds, yes.
So the waterbed had these drawers on the bottom, and so we were hanging out in her mom's room because her mom had cable in the room, and so we're all sitting there, and somebody reached under the little cabinet or the little drawers underneath, and they pulled it open, and there's pornographic tapes, there's some magazines. That was the first time I ever saw a sex toy and did not know what it was. And I remember my friend picking it up and looking at it, and she's like, we're all just kind of looking at it. Now that I'm older, I'm like, oh god, I hope it wasn't used. But at the time, we didn't know, and I kind of remember that now. Y'all kind of took me back to that moment.
I had a buddy of mine who was trying to find money in his parents' room, and when he pulled the drawer out, a marital assistant tool rolled out and hit his hand, and he absolutely he's he never went back into the room ever again. He was traumatized.
Oh, so he knew what it was? Because I didn't know what this was. I just remember seeing it. I remember it was your basic, and it was a light pink. And I remember looking at it, I kind of knew what it was, but you were like, is that really what it is? I'd never seen one in person.
Oh no, this was a full dildo, so he definitely knew what it was. And it rolled out and touched his hand, and he absolutely he barely get the words out. I was like, dude, what happened? He was traumatized for. He was like, dude, this is what happened to me yesterday. I was like, oh my god, it's horrific. This dude's traumatized for life. Very hilarious. Then of course we made fun of him forever because of.
Oh, of course you have to.
Most of us never go back to that place once we come out, So.
Yeah, he was just my dad is older, I guess. It was horrible.
All I know is my mother never worked hard enough to have that many back massagers.
Oh, Frank.
To grow up in the 80s and 90s. Next is So Beautiful and So Dangerous.
Yeah.
And
so this one is based on the comic book of the same name by Angus McKee. It's actually not a short story from Heavy Metal. This is a full-on graphic novel, 64 pages or something. And it's so weird because, virtually none of the story actually made it into the cartoon. This one is almost entirely, it's almost entirely created for the cartoon. And really the cartoon doesn't tell a story. It's basically just a bunch of vignettes using character designs by Angus McKee, but almost nothing to do with the original comic book. So it's a weird that they even bothered to give him a credit on this. They could have just changed the look of the aliens, and they'd have probably been just fine.
Well, they like the title too. I mean, the name is pretty cool.
Well, and they used the little robot, and they used the smiley face spaceship. They used some elements, but not a lot.
And I think for a while, if you look in the old the magazines of heavy metal, I think they were selling animated cells of that at the time. Like, I want to say I found some like 1980 ones where they're like selling them on like through mail order, because I remember distinctly seeing one of the smiley face spaceship, which I always thought looked fucking amazing. We all now know where fucking Deadmau5 got his look from.
Yeah, it reminds me of a cartoon that they ran on Night Flight, if I remember correctly, about like roaches using robots to try to conquer the world. And there's like a ridiculous like Captain Everything sort of superhero and this little kid character and such. And a lot of those design elements seem to have derived from this particular short.
Okay, no. I just always remember one time I saw a fucking cover of Deadmau5 and I was like, shit, that's so beautiful, so dangerous. Like, what the fuck? With the whole mouth and the eyes and stuff.
Yeah, and Angus McKee has an extremely unique style and very ornate. It's another instance where it looks like it was done on a computer before the computers could do anything like this.
Yeah.
And it's very much so 70s and 80s. So many like weird pastel-y colors, and everything's got that sheen to it, that metallic lighting and shit. And it's just super unique art style. And it's weird to me that a guy that could paint that well didn't get to be more famous. But I guess he wasn't the most prolific guy. He did some more stuff in heavy metal. He did some stuff for DC in the 90s. He also did get into computer animation, which I don't think did him any favors. Very few people who were doing computer stuff in the 90s were doing work that holds up very well today. But this project looks really good, but it's almost zero reflection in the cartoon. The cartoon's just kind of doing its own thing. It's basically an extended music video with lots of drug references.
And you have John Candy again, and you have what's his name? Egon, the actor, Ghostbusters. Oh,
Harold Ramis.
Yeah, I was my brain wasn't clicking in, and we both hit it at the same time.
I kept wanting to say Eugene Levy, and I was like, it's not Eugene Levy.
And
he's in there too.
I don't know about you guys. I've always had trouble with those two. They're not really that similar, but for some reason, I still kind of confuse them.
Well, I mean, I'm looking at the Wikipedia, and this is Eugene Levy is the male reporter, so he's in it.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
All those guys, and Joe Flaherty's in there too. All those guys are in there. For some reason, the girls from SCTV didn't appear to be in the cartoon, but all the guys were.
Yeah, they all lend their voices.
I don't think they got Moranis though, did they?
No. John Candy did quite a lot of heavy lifting in this movie because he did quite a few voices.
This is Harold Ramis' Zeke in So Beautiful and So Damned.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Wait, who did we just say? Harold Ramis. You asked if they had who?
Eugene Levy.
No, not Eugene Levy. Frank. Who did you just say?
Rick Moranis.
Rick Moranis. Okay, gotcha. Getting all these 80s Canadian actors mixed up.
What did y'all think of this? Well, we know what Frank thought of. What about you, Mac?
Of which one? I thought this was we didn't even explain this one, but basically, chick gets beamed up into space. She has sex with robots, and they do blow. Right? That's basically what it is.
Yeah, pretty much.
I thought that this was like legit excellent animation in this one. The robots, the creature creation, the fluidity of the movement, the detail in the backgrounds. I thought this was not the best of the movie, but probably second place.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. It probably does have the best animation because they're not even attempting to tell a story, and it's very much like Hookers and Blow. This is exactly what you're here for. You literally have like a vacuum machine that spits up coke rather than sucking it down, because that's all for the aliens' noses. It's just one song after another too. You got Queen Bee by Grand Funk Railroad. You got I Must Be Dreamin' by Cheap Trick, which was one of my favorites on the soundtrack.
Yeah.
You got Crazy, A Suitable Case for Treatment by Nazareth. You've got All of You by Don Felder. You got Prefabricated by Trust. And then the coup de grace, Heavy Metal by Sammy Hagar. Probably the best song on the album.
Metal.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely the soundtrack for the album and the magazine. The lyrics are so perfect for all this material.
Let's be honest, this episode was definitely it is a time capsule into that time where cocaine was seen as like recreational. Everybody does coke. Like, it's not a big deal. No.
How the fuck you think this shit got animated, motherfucker?
I love the line in this one where they're talking about how she bangs that robot and stuff, and she's like, "Mixed marriages don't work. I'm afraid I'll come home and find you screwing a toaster or something like that." This one definitely had the most laughs in it. Yeah, this This one had the most like legit laughs.
Well,
Well,
dude,
she was
their
going to make the
relationship
robot
goes from
compute to
0 to
Judaism
90
too,
in, like,
wasn't
10
she?
seconds.
Wasn't she
What was
going to
that,
make the
Frank?
robot convert to Judaism?
Yes,
Yeah, something like that.
she wants a Jewish wedding.
Yeah,
You
so
know,
I-
it's funny. I didn't think, and actually at this point, I wouldn't have. I saw this movie after Van Hagar, so the only thing I knew Sammy Hagar from was I Can't Drive 55 when he took over for Diamond Dave. I would have given more credence to his time in Van Halen if I'd known he had done this song and if it had been exposed to the song beforehand. But by the time I saw this movie, I think we were already into the Crystal Pepsi era of Van Halen. So even heavy metal couldn't quite salvage it, but definitely one of, if not the best Hagar songs.
Yes, and androids are people too. That's actually graffiti written on the side of the ship.
I drive way better when I'm stoned.
Good
I just love
landing, man.
I just love the fact that when the robot and the woman are going through the ship, it's massive inside. It's like a small planet. And then they get to the space station, and it's just massive.
My favorite single issue of Heavy Metal Magazine was the November 1989 cover dated edition. It had a Luis Royo cover of like a cyber babe, you know, she had like a readout visor, she had a laser pistol and shit. And it had a story in it called No Imagination by Horatio Altuna. And there were a lot of erotic artists that worked around or in Heavy Metal Magazine, but for me, that one was always my favorite because not only were they sexy, but he also had really great panel-to-panel storytelling and very human characters. They weren't like gigantic breasts and big butts and all that kind of stuff. They were more reasonable dimensions, and there was just kind of a softness to everybody, like a humanity to them, which I liked. Sometimes heavy metal could be so like metal, you know, and I like that this person had a more naturalistic quality, but also like a very cinematic style. And the story of No Imagination is about a reporter who's working in a dystopia, because everything was a dystopia in Heavy Metal Magazine, a near future type situation. And, you know, there's a lot of government oppression and there's a lot of oppression of political thought and stuff, but for the most part, people are still kind of living their lives as we do. And so this guy runs around with a camera and he's basically a freelance reporter, and it's very much a if it bleeds, it leads, man bites dog kind of scene where you're trying to find the most provocative thing possible to get in front of your camera lens, which of course, this being near future tales, seeing these guys running around with full-sized video cameras, where today we would just be fucking using our phones, it automatically puts it in a specific date and time. But this guy just keeps filming like terrorist attacks and rapes and all this stuff that's going on, and it was an interesting story. It was very well told, and it was also definitely very much erotic. I still have my copy around here somewhere, and I gotta tell you, some people keep mementos of lovers, but in this case, the lover is the memento if I still have my copy. So I definitely spent quality time with that magazine. Plus, they had a bunch of other stories because Heavy Metal always had like at least 4 or 5 different stories. And so I remember there being one about like a girl going to a museum and seeing like a display of primitive hunters, and then the story flashes back to the lives those hunters would have actually had in the time period. I think that was like a silent story. And I think there was one that was more cartoonish, more like a Hergé kind of thing, Tintin kind of thing, where it's like a thief running across rooftops and trying to score, and he's got like a little old lady he's working with, and you always had all these different interesting stories, and it very much Heavy Metal felt like it either inspired or was a primer for stuff like Liquid TV or MTV Oddities or like any kind of animation festivals where you always got a wide variety of stuff and always trying to be experimental. They always knew where the bread and butter was. They always gave you the violent fantasy sci-fi stuff with the movies, but they also tried to make sure they had space for more artsy stuff as well, and so you got a nice selection basically.
Yeah, to me, these are all under the same umbrella. Your Liquid Televisions, Heavy Metals, things like that. What else? It's almost like an adult version of Mad Magazine. You know, all this like kind of eclectic, semi-taboo, adult-oriented stuff that I kind of aspired to kind of want when I was a kid. Does that make sense? Where you're sort of like, I don't know, it was almost like hipper or cooler. It's sort of not mainstream, but it kind of is mainstream, but it's not mainstream.
It's interesting you talk about the whole aspirational quality of that, because I think that was one of the problems I had with Heavy Metal growing up in general, not just the magazine, but in general. Like me growing up, I was raised by 2 women. I didn't have a stepfather until I was 8, and he wasn't like macho guy. He liked mostly 50s and 60s music as well. So a lot of oldies, a lot of country music. And so metal, any kind of rock in general really was not familiar to me. You know, even when I would listen to stuff that was mainstream in the neighborhood, you're talking about your Michael Jackson and pop stuff, right?
Yeah.
It took special people to listen to rock. And it was always the older guys that like had the Vans with the Barbarians painted on the side, you know, those kind of dudes. Or if he was a younger guy, it was always the dude who had the long hair and the rock t-shirt. And it's hard to appreciate how aggressive Heavy Metal was to regular people in those days and times, especially because you had things like the Satanic Panic going on and Stranger Danger. And so you'd see people wearing shirts that had like skeletons on it and like people who'd been flayed, you know, your Iron Metal and your Iron Maiden and your Judas Priest and all that kind of stuff. I remember one guy that was into Ozzy Osbourne had the poster on his wall of him turning into a werewolf. And as a kid, you know, horror stuff spooked me. That sort of like raw masculine aggression kind of disturbed me. And so I didn't really hang out with those kids. You know, I mostly hung out with like girls or kids more my age that were, you know, soft like I was. And so it was always some other people that was into that kind of stuff. And it really wasn't until I started hanging out with my father and my extended family on his side that I started to have any real exposure to a lot of that stuff that had been kept from me. But it was kind of off-putting and scary to me because it was just a level of macho that I wasn't used to when I was a younger kid. And it was always those guys that would have been in line to see the movie with you and your family when you all saw Heavy Metal back in the 80s.
True. These guys, now that I'm older, they were definitely all metalhead.
And again, that was a very specific time because you would have, you had the boomers, and of course this was the richest generation in American history. Had more money, more resources, more attention, and, when they grew up in a very chaste environment for the most part. It was very repressed in the 50s and 60s. You just didn't have a lot of exposure to things. And of course you had that outward rebellion, partly because of anxieties over the Vietnam War and stuff. But you had protests and you had all that libertine environment and a lot of drugs, obviously. And so there was an audience for adult animation that had never been there before, at least not in large enough quantities. And, the 70s in general were super experimental, coming out of the 60s, the destruction of old Hollywood, the coming of new Hollywood. And so you'd have stuff like the Ralph Bakshi cartoons. You're in the same...
yeah.
Right?
I mean, I remember seeing Wizards and Fritz the Cat. What was the other? Fire and Ice, which is one of mine and Fryhole's personal favorites.
Oh, I love it too.
Well, show it no love, man. I don't hear you talk about it enough. I'm just kidding with you.
The 40th anniversary, that one's not too far away, so we'll get to it.
All right, yeah. That's still one of my personal favorites to watch on a slow day. You can never go wrong with fucking Fire and Ice.
Well, and this is all coming out of a lot of that stuff was coming out of the head comics of the late 60s 60s too. One of the first things, I think the thing that made Ralph Bakshi's reputation was he adapted Robert Crumb's Fritz the Cat. And that was, literally like an X-rated comic book. And if I remember correctly, X-rated animation, right?
Which one?
Fritz the Cat?
Yes, that was a Crumb, which apparently, if I remember correctly, reading Crumb hated it. Absolutely hated it. Would you consider that furries porn, though?
I would definitely consider it a gateway, yeah. Probably one of the first instances of that. Because, you're essentially taking Disney-style funny animals and having them fucking do drugs and shit. So, pretty much, yeah.
I just always remember seeing the cover of it, and I always wondered, like, you would walk through the aisles of the video store, and, like, why isn't this in the kids section? Because it was a comic. Because for the longest time, I didn't know what it was. I just saw Fritz the Cat. And, he's sitting on, I think he's sitting on a couch with a big boobed character, a female character, and that's it. And I didn't know what it was until, I think, after Heavy Metal, I realized, wow, there's adult cartoons. So I started looking for it, and I found Fire and Ice, Wizard, Fritz the Cat, Hey Good Looking, which apparently, I guess, yeah, they're all bocce movies, so.
Did you ever see, like, Fantastic Planet or Watership Down?
I did see Fantastic Planet. I did Watership Down. I think we watched that in school.
Yeah, I might have watched that. I think I watched that in school as well.
I think we watched it in school, because I remember thinking, like, this is fucked up.
Yeah, an entire generation is traumatized by the nightmare sequence from that
fucking
movie.
Rabbits, dude. Like, holy shit. I did see, there's this other one. I can never remember the name of it. It takes place with these creatures that come across a creature that's a giant brain, and he, it's something about evolution, and he asks one of the creatures, he's going to freeze him because he knows one day he'll become evil and he wants him to kill him. And I remember renting that and like, dude, this shit's like heavy, but it was a cartoon. It was violent. So I was like, I'm going to watch it. I was introduced to some anime, but like not much.
Was it Gandahar?
What?
The movie with the giant brain?
I don't remember.
I just Googled animation giant brain and Gandahar came up. It looks like it's French. Probably not. Was it subtitled?
I don't remember. I don't believe so.
What was the movie that it was like totally rotoscoped? It had a bunch of famous people in it. Wasn't there like a David Bowie?
Oh, you're talking about
American Pop?
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, it's got the boomer stink all over it because it was them self-mythologizing, telling the history of the modern Americans through their popular music and having, all these different artists appear or semblances of them appearing while, pantomiming, lip-syncing essentially various pop songs and stuff. But yeah, it was basically a telling, I think, of like the 50s through the 80s through American popular music. And I think that was that Bakshi as well?
I believe so. I think pretty much anything that we're going to talk about in terms of animation in the 80s is always going to be Bakshi.
Correct. Yeah, it's Bakshi.
Yeah, I was going to say, he was a huge influence on the genre at that time, if I remember correctly.
Well, and you also had the feedback loop of cyberpunk because you look at books like William Gibson's Neuromancer. That fueled a lot of the dystopic movies and stuff that came afterwards. But, stuff like Escape from New York and Blade Runner and Gibson's stuff were all influenced by these European artists, coming over through things like heavy metal. And then their works ended up inspiring everything that came afterwards. Like all the dystopian sci-fi since then owes a debt to those creators, and they owed a debt to heavy metal. But it's often forgotten about. A lot of people zero in on William Gibson and the other cyberpunk authors without realizing how much that European influence had on them and those comic books had on them, because there was always a tendency to downplay any influence of comic books in popular culture, especially something like sci-fi. And it's funny because cyberpunk didn't have the best reputation either. It was often criticized about being style over substance and not like having real speculative futurist qualities, being more about the mood of the times, reflecting the sense of dystopia and the decline of Western civilization that was in place in the 70s and 80s, and to some degree never fully abated. We've had rising and lowering of the currents, but certainly right now that sort of jaundiced view of the future is something I think we all can appreciate. But a lot of that goes back to the 70s and 80s and stuff like heavy metal, where a lot of the sci-fi that preceded it was all about the glorious future that waited to us. Wait till we get to the moon, wait till we get to Mars. And it was this type of material that was kind of going, well, that's not going to fix the fact that we're still going to be human beings no matter where we're going, we're going to fuck everything up.
And so all these are contemporary to heavy metal, right? All the stuff we're talking about, Fire and Ice, American Pop, right? This is all.
That's one thing that's interesting.
I would say it was its own subculture, like people who knew this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned anime earlier. This was very much like proto-anime because the Japanese had a somewhat similar trajectory where they were fed this steady diet of Walt Disney, and they came up with Astro Boy, and you had stuff like Speed Racer and such, which was them sort of doing their version of Western-style animation. But over time, they got more and more of those more adulterating influences, and probably were also influenced by what the Europeans were doing. And so you slowly get to a place where they're doing even something like Gatchaman. You've got the hermaphroditic villain in that, and you've got a lot of violence and a lot of more mature action that got cut out of when it got sent to the rest of the world. And slowly that builds up to something like Akira in 1988, which is very cyberpunk and very indebted to cyberpunk, where they've clearly been absorbing all of this stuff around them and are now one of the key purveyors of cyberpunk in outside of novels and stuff. So Akira begets Ghost in the Shell. So the Japanese definitely had their own trajectory, but they were being influenced by the same stuff the Americans were. And of course, you have to figure transgressive cartoons like what Bakshi was doing probably influenced them as well, because they became more and more transgressive also.
Shit, this is getting deep. I thought we were going to talk about boobs and porn and cartoons.
We're getting a little mix. We got a nice little mix going. So I guess now is probably a good time to actually start talking about the movie. And none of us saw it in 81, In my case, what it was is for years, you could not get the movie legally. There was major rights issues. This is something that happened a lot with 80s movies, where a lot of the soundtracks were driven by popular songs, and they hadn't necessarily made allowances for video. These were supposed to be used either on broadcast television, and sometimes not even that, or for theatrical presentation. It's kind of like how there's a lot of fighting over streaming and royalties for streaming these days, trying to figure out what people are owed, given that people are just pulling this stuff up for free and it's part of services and shit. Well, they had that same problem back in the 80s, and because the heavy metal movie had such a heavy soundtrack of big artists, I don't think it ran on television. It wasn't available on VHS. And I want to say it was the 10th anniversary release, but it could have even been a 15th anniversary release before they were finally able to clear the rights and get it out on VHS. And if I remember correctly, they made a big deal about it because it actually had a foil cover, like foil enhanced cover, which is very 90s.
VHS.
Mm-hmm. And of course, it had that Chris Achilleos cover with Tarna writing the bird thing. Very iconic. Chris Achilleos was definitely somebody who was closely associated with Heavy Metal magazine. And that whole vibe, that 70s, 80s fantasy vibe.
So after that one, we have Tarna.
Which again, a little strange because it's credited as original story by Daniel Goldberg and Lynn Blum, but they acknowledge that it's based on Arzak by Moebius, or Mobius, however you want to say it. Arzak is a pretty famous story. I think that a lot of Japanese stuff, particularly Nausicaä of the Winds, probably came from Arzak, certainly that art style. And yet, aside from the flying pterodactyl things, very little of the visuals of this sequence in any way recall the artist that is credited with originating it. It very much, and again, Tarna, I think, is so heavily associated with heavy metal that it's weird to think that she probably didn't exist before this cartoon. I don't think she existed at all before this cartoon was created for it, but they put her on their poster, her and Dem, so I guess they made a point of positioning her to be the representative of all the hot babes on Heavy Metal magazine covers.
Well, I mean, they're coming out with a toy figure of her with the bird. Hello?
And I think it's worth noting, too, that this was before very many of the bad girls had come into existence. I mean, I'm pretty sure this was around the same time or before Elektra. And so probably a lot of people, this was their first experience with the quote-unquote strong female protagonist. Basically a chick who's a badass and can kick as much ass as a dude can. She was sort of a prototype for that type of character, I would say. And I'm sure, they did have some of that in cinema and live action, but in comics and genre materials, she was, I think, on the vanguard.
So you would say she's somewhat Xena-esque?
I'm sure that her or people like her inspired the creation of a Xena. I mean, There's a lot of Red Sonja in Tarna's DNA, I would say, so that was definitely in the comic books beforehand. For sure. So, but seeing that in animation and seeing it reach a much broader audience, I think that maybe had an impact.
But we're kind of missing the whole theme about the Naknar, how he corrupts each story. For this story specifically, he corrupts a religious group that's wandering the desert.
Were they a religious group?
I thought so. I mean, they have that emblem. They're wandering the desert. I don't know. Weren't they? Or were they just like nomads?
I want to say they were just like nomads. I think that they got the green goo all over them, and then they became evil cyborg dudes, which...
Yeah, well, they became like this, like, I guess like the Huns, and they just start conquering people left and right.
Yeah, and it gets me too, because I always associate that sequence with the Blue Oyster Cult song, and yet that's way earlier, and instead there's like fucking E5150 by Sabbath and shit.
Mutant dudes conquering cities. There's a bunch of these religious people that are getting their fucking city torn down. They always had, the Tarakans or some shit would come protect them, and they're all gone except for Tarna, and she shows up and tries to fucking save them, right? Is that basically what's going on? If I remember correctly?
Yeah, and it's worth noting too that Tarna does not speak. She prepares for battle in part by swimming nude to reach a platform with her costume on it. And then there's that one sequence where she goes in the bar and starts chopping people's heads off, scored to Through Being Cool by Devo, which unfortunately didn't make it to the soundtrack.
Oh, I mean, they actually do look like Devo also.
Remember some of the later details. Remember the bar fight scene was fucking cool. Let me see.
Well, I remember her getting dressed was very, it was a very long scene in the theater.
Yep.
She definitely took her time getting dressed. She shows up. She sees the priest. They're all murdered. She goes to the bar. She finds the symbol. She, I guess, removes the guy's head with the Devo band in the background, jamming out.
So here's some of my notes. The drone-like footage following the robot bird was awesome.
Yeah.
The gray bush, I appreciate the attention to detail. And I said, this is the most sensual costume change I've ever seen. Puts any Iron Man suit up to shame. She chops those dudes up, and then some guys, after she gets captured, the guy says, have her bound and washed, then bring her to me. And it reminded me of It's Always Sunny, where what's his fucking name is like, I want you to clean yourself.
Dennis.
Yeah, Dennis. I want you, but most importantly, clean.
And you know what the crazy is? That's one of my favorite It's Sunny in Philadelphia. That's the mountain one where they're snowboarding and they're doing a whole 80s montage to like snow movies that came out at that time. There was like a shitload of movies that came out that were like Porky's inspired snowboarding and ski movies. And that's like one of my favorite Sunnies because it falls into all those tropes where Charlie's like, what's this voice keeps talking in the background narrating everything that's going on? And they're like, just go with it, Charlie. We're on the mountain. It's all about the mountain. Frank, yeah, dude, that's like one of my favorite episodes. That's a good one.
Tatiana, I want you to clean yourself. Let me see. What else do I have? The bird is badass that she flies on.
Yeah. Dude, have you seen the toy that goes to this?
No.
So they have the Tarna toy. It looks just like Tarna with the bird, and she actually can straddle the bird. It's coming out. That's why when Frank was talking about how, like, she's kind of she's on the cover, but she represents this movie the most, and it's just kind of cool they're coming out with the toy as well. I think it's already coming out, or it's already out.
Is it another like Super 7? Is it like a Super 7 shit where it's like $300 for the fucking figure?
It's like $150, I think. It's not too crazy.
Oh no, $100. Jesus Christ.
They're all $100 these days. Yeah, it's weird because Tarna, she was in the movie. She wasn't really featured much in the magazine though. And then like in the last few years, as heavy metal has tried to clear a space for itself within, the direct market, since as discussed, they never really had a huge presence there, and they're releasing more comic book sized editions. One of the ways in which they did that was they're trying to commodify Tarna after all these years by doing a solo book about her. And I read one of them. It was by, I'm trying to remember her name, the one who does all those books for Dark Horse. I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but I read that one and it was all right. It was largely solid because, again, she's mute and really strangely violent. And I think it also had some underage nudity, which was Alex DeCampi is her name. I don't remember who the artist was. So definitely still going to places you wouldn't expect in mainstream comics to this day. But the little graphic novel I read was all right. And I think they did another one that Jackson Geis was working on, but I wasn't compelled enough by the Alex DeCampi story to move on to the next one. But it is interesting interesting that they're getting like Alex Ross to paint covers of Tarna now, because this is what his sweet spot in terms of popular culture. So of course they could manage to get him to do this sort of stuff. But it's weird that they waited 30 or 35 years to finally start exploiting the visibility of Tarna as an ambassador to Heavy Metal magazine.
I just realized now her name is Tarna and she's a Tarak.
Yeah, I think that whole deal. No, it reminded me. There was a meme that our loyal listener Sean McLaughlin tweeted out earlier today, or he retweeted it, where it's like a magazine clipping, and it's like new for 2020, literally the exact same shit we sold you 35 years ago, and it's got like He-Man figures. It says, "Your eyes don't deceive you. You're not crazy. These are the same toys we brought to you. You brought you back in the 1980s. But who cares? Buy them again, 1999. We're creatively bankrupt." And it's just like the same shit, because that's all they're doing now, is just putting out the same shit we bought years and years ago. It's like, we know you're gonna buy it again, and we
now $25.99 was $3.99.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so how does this one end up? Oh yeah, and then so she's captured, right? After the dude says bathe her and bring her to me, then they whip the shit out of her. And then what is it? Home dude says, "It's your time to die, you Tarakian bitch." I was like, bro, this is intense. The bird saves her.
Okay, so they throw her in a pit to die.
Yeah.
And they're gonna kill the bird by shooting a harpoon into it. The bird pulls, the guy gets hit, it escapes, it swings down, it picks her up, it flies off with her. The priest and his followers follow on these giant bats to get to her, because she now realized she needs to get to the Lochnar that's wedged into a mountain. Now we've kind of skipped over the part where during the whole time the Lochnar's telling these stories, it's getting larger and larger in the house with the little girl in it, as he's telling them the stories about its adventures, and that's going to lead to the ending. But of course, Tarna flies with the bird, realizes she has sacrificed herself to destroy it. The Lochnar's trying to convince her not to. She lifts her sword up, gets hit by lightning, and nosedives right into it.
Well, wait. So that's after her battle with the big boss?
Well, yes. Right? I'm sorry. Yeah, I jumped. There's a scene where she fights the male priest, where his hand turns into that awesome saw, and he's kind of cutting her.
Yeah, she's all like bloody and all slashed up and stuff as she's fighting him.
But as she gets the upper hand on him, starts beating the shit out of him, does that awesome thing where she pops off his helmet and just puts her fist through his head.
Well, she takes his own blender arm and stabs it in his chest, right?
Yeah,
dude.
Very metal.
She fucking punches him in the head. Then she goes after Lochnar, right?
Yeah, you're correct. I skipped over all that scene. Yeah, my bad.
It's all good. Anyway, she destroys Lochnar, and then isn't there like another?
Well, the whole point it continues, because there's always one that she was the last Tarakian, and I'm assuming it's just a vicious circle where the Lochnar is destroyed and he's reformed somewhere else, and a new Tarakian is born, and the little girl in the farmhouse, because the farmhouse explodes, and I think I watched something about that where they ran out of money, so they couldn't animate it, so they just blew up the little wooden house, because it's the one scene that kind of stands out in the movie, because the whole movie is animated, and then the last one is literally one of those little model wooden houses people would build, and they just blow it up.
Yeah, I think that was literally the rotoscoping. They did that specifically because they were supposed to animate over it, and then they didn't. But for me, because you'd already had the radar rider astronaut looking like a collage at the beginning, to me it felt like thematically correct. It never bothered me that they switched to live action for that last segment.
Well, I always thought it was weird, and I remember seeing something and they're like, actually they ran out of money. Like by the end, they didn't have a budget to animate that scene, so they were just like, fuck it, just blow it up anyway. And so just to end the story.
And that's it.
It was first discovered on Earth. Some say we can never win against it. Some say we've already lost. And some call it by a name. Heavy Metal 2000. There's a new warrior in the galaxy.
Don't talk, don't touch, don't even breathe.
She's armed to the teeth.
Who's gonna pay for all this?
And she'll take you down big time.
You shouldn't have done that.
It's not for the timid. It's not for the meek. And it's definitely not for your parents.
Over 200 dirty words.
You're not from our world.
No way.
This is Heavy Metal 2000, and it kicks ass. Featuring stellar music from the most lethal names in heavy metal. It'll push you to the limit and drive you to madness.
Insanity has to end.
Heavy Metal 2000 rocks on video and DVD.
Why didn't you tell me that before?
It'll suck your mind dry.
You fools!
So having enjoyed all that stuff, now let's have a big old downer. So National Lampoon did super well in the 70s and 80s. One thing that's notable, I think, in the 60s and 70s was there was the earliest versions of wokeness, a greater sense of the humanity of other people, other races, other genders besides straight white men. But there was always this backlash too. In the 80s in particular, there's a lot of mocking the new man, the sensitive man, that kind of shit. We were all about the macho and stuff. And heavy metal to some degree is a reflection of that because it is about tits and guns and swords and shit. And so in the 90s, there was, I think, a backlash against the sort of sex comedy that National Lampoon was known for, and maybe against the type of stories that were told in heavy metal. And so you saw kind of like a regression from this sort of thing. And National Lampoon, I think, went under sometime around that time, and they ended up having to sell Heavy Metal magazine. And it just so happened you had an independent creator who had the money to buy this thing. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles had blown up in the late 80s. You know, those rights to all those cartoons and toys had made Kevin Eastman a very rich man, and this is a guy who clearly really loved, you know, the independent comic books in general and comics. So he formed Tundra, which bled him out of millions of dollars as he gave all these creators money up front and told them take all the time you need to make great art. And more often than not, they didn't make any fucking thing, and he just went in the hole with that shit. But another thing he did that he did a bit of a money pit was he bought Heavy Metal magazine and came to really define what heavy metal would be in the 90s and early 2000s. It definitely got away from the European vibe, got a little bit more Western centric and maybe a little bit more British as well. He was buddies with Simon Bisley, so all of a sudden you saw him doing tons of covers and doing odd bits and pieces. But also he worked with the Kitchen Sink Press, and they had this graphic novel that he was working on called The Melting Pot. Fix-It, did you ever read that one?
I think so. That sounds very familiar.
Yeah, it was polybagged with a trading card, and it was Kevin Eastman drew it, but then Simon Bisley would go over it and paint over the drawing, so it very much felt like a melding of their two styles. And it was about this alien world where there's all this like barbarisms and shit. Eric Talbot, who's a friend of Kevin Eastman's, helped to dialogue it and helped to work on it. The miniseries never was completed, and I think it speaks a lot to the mentality going into the Melting Pot. But they advertised a contest where you could win a 1969 Camaro hand-painted by Bisley. I wonder if anybody ever actually got that thing. But the simple fact that not only were you getting a Camaro, but it had to be a classic muscle car as well. And then, of course, you had the involvement of Jolie Strain. I think later in the 1990s, Kevin Eastman met Jolie Strain, who was this famous, maybe famous is a strong word. She was a notable B-movie actress, and they ended up getting married, and they were together up through the early 2000s, and she ended up getting incorporated into Heavy Metal magazine a lot. They basically created a character for her to portray and had a variety of both the new Heavy Metal and the old Heavy Metal artists paint her on the covers and such, and eventually that morphed into Fact 2 or Fact Squared, F-A-K-K, which I guess they realized that wasn't the most commercial of names. So by the year 2000, when they released the sequel movie, it was just called Heavy Metal 2000, and they even replicated the VHS box art. It was Simon Bisley, but they still had the silver background, the silver metallic background on this one. Fix-It, you saw that, like, did you see it theatrically or on video or what?
I want to say I saw it on video. I've only seen it like twice, and I don't remember it very well. I just remember the first time I saw it, I was super excited. It was another Heavy Metal, super disappointed. And then I think I gave it another try a few years later and got through half of it. It was just like, I was, the only thing I remember was Michael Ironside is in it. And I'm a huge Michael Ironside fan, and that's it.
Yeah, a great voice for the villain, but yeah, it's essentially Tarna at
my dark
link.
side. That's my dark side.
Yeah. Oh, true that. Yeah, and but yeah, aside from some of the voice talents, I don't hate it as much as you do, but it's a way more of a chore to get through because it's just a feature-length Tarna story. And part of the appeal of Heavy Metal was that it's a mixed bag. You've got all this different stuff, and there isn't all this different stuff. It's just a shitty, action graphic novel thing with a hot babe who's got guns and swords and shit.
Yeah.
And it's funny too, because watching it, one of the things that I really noticed was how anonymous the soundtrack was. And so I expected to be a bunch of like new metal assholes, But I look at the soundtrack credits and it's Monster Magnet, Pantera, Insane Clown Posse, System of a Down, Days of the New, Queens of the Stone Age, Machine Head, Billy Idol, and Bauhaus. And it's like, I couldn't have told you any of those people were on that soundtrack. They must have picked like the worst, most pedestrian B-sides to feature in this movie, because the music just does not have an impact on your enjoyment of the flick at all. I could almost completely turned out. It seemed like the movie didn't rely very much on the music. You get snippets, but it didn't have the vibe. It just seemed like a shitty wannabe anime, you know?
Mm-hmm. I could see that. Like I said, I don't remember it very well, but it's been so long since I've seen it, but I remember distinctly not enjoying it, and I was not in a rush to watch for this podcast, so I did not watch it.
I mean, I remember it fairly well because I watched it in the last few months, but I'm not going to recap it because, they even have a wannabe Lochnar type thing, and they've got some horrid CGI toward the end that just sticks out like a sore thumb. And there's a wannabe twist, but it's just a nothing. It doesn't have that cool rock vibe. They've got some tits in it, but they really toned that down considerably. So it doesn't feel nearly as saucy or as fun. It's just this thing that exists. That happened too, I guess. But yeah, not that the first Heavy Metal made a ton of money, but this movie, like, I think it might have actually even lost some money. It just did fucking nothing. And then I think one issue that Heavy Metal's had is that it used to be they were the only game in town. All the cool European storytelling was done through Heavy Metal magazine. And if anything, it's interesting because companies like Epic Comics, the Marvel's independent comics division, started getting a lot of this material. Moebius in particular, a lot of his stuff like Airtight Garage got published through Epic. Akira, if you recall correctly, was published through Epic as well for the first time for U.S. audiences. And going into the 2000s, you had companies like MDM, but I think most notably 2002, Humanoids Publishing got started. And Humanoids were the people who published Metal Hurlant in France, the original guys. And so instead of licensing the shit to an American publisher, they were just doing it themselves. And Humanoids has been more or less in existence since 2002. I think they've had some hiatuses, and at one point they were being published through DC Comics, which is a weird combination. But they've been around representing a lot of these same creators. And in fact, they were able to get Metal Hurlant out as a TV series, a live action one called Metal Hurlant Chronicles in 2011. And then, as you mentioned, you had David Fincher, who tried to do a Heavy Metal spin-off show, which ended up becoming Love, Death, and Robots. I think that there's still a place for Heavy Metal, although there is a certain like toxic masculinity to Heavy Metal that I think would probably turn some people off. But I think that you have to have a place for that male aggression and that sexuality, that raw sexuality that you would get, the cyberpunk qualities. I think that there's, not only has Heavy Metal had an impact on the culture, but I think that there needs to be a safe space in the culture for that swaggering masculinity. I want for Heavy Metal to exist, and I want it to continue to have representation, even if it hasn't changed a little bit. I still want that Heavy Metal vibe out there available to us to enjoy.
The second one was just one whole story, wasn't it? It was
just one art essentially. Yeah, it's like the one was the collection of stories, and one was the graphic novel, basically.
Michael Ironside was in the second movie, right? That he played one of the voices.
Yeah, he was the villain in that one.
And then Julie Strain played the main character, right?
Yeah, were you into Julie Strain?
After I watched that movie.
Yeah, it kind of felt like the movie was a culmination with her because she'd been playing around with comic book stuff for years prior to that, and of course she was married to Kevin Eastman until a few years after the movie. And they did a lot of Heavy Metal covers before the film of her playing the lead character. I don't remember what the heroine's name was, but they did a lot of images of her by various artists as that character before the movie came out. And then after the movie pretty much bombed, then all that shit went away and she kind of faded out as well. I think it was sort of her last hurrah of her career.
I would have to dig through my stuff, but I'm pretty sure I have a picture of myself with her at Chicago. Before it was Wizard World, it was Chicago Comic-Con at the Rosemont Horizon. And I went when it was that, and then I went, I think the first 2 years it was Wizard World Chicago. It was a huge, just a giant con, bigger than Comicpalooza down here. I think at the time the only bigger one was San Diego, but I'm almost positive that I got my picture with her in one of those.
She's fucking dead.
Yeah, she died. Yeah. What, this year or last year?
Yeah, this year, January.
Yeah. What'd she die of?
Late stage dementia.
Oh, dude, that's like the worst fucking thing to die of.
Well, she had a traumatic brain injury, I think, when she was in her 20s.
Yeah,
that caused her to have the amnesia. And then the dementia came as a consequence of the cerebral damage that was done.
She was doing a stunt or something, wasn't she? And got hit in the head?
I don't know if it was a stunt. It might have, I mean, it's certainly possible.
Or riding a horse or something?
I think I want to say riding a horse was what it was. That sounds right.
Correct.
Yeah.
You're correct. Retrograde amnesia due to a head injury after a fall from a horse in her 20s.
Sucks.
Yeah, and my understanding is, again, it never returned. So she lost like her entire life at that point, essentially.
Oh my God.
Yeah. It's bizarre how that works. You have all these, like, I mean, I don't know the details of her specific instance, but, you know, to have like the motor skills and to have like education, but to have no connection to any of the people from your life, you know, to never recognize your parents as such and shit like that, that's got to be a fucking trip.
That'd be awful. Yeah.
But that happened when that would have happened in the early 80s, right?
Yeah, because I think she was 60-ish when she passed. And so she was in her 30s, like I said, late 30s, mid to late 30s, I think, when she was doing the heavy metal stuff. And the majority of her career was in the 80s through early 90s B movies.
So that would have all been post-injury. That's strange.
Yeah, I think her entire film career, or the majority of it at least, was after that had happened, yeah.
What a bizarre life.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? Usually when you hear about, a tragic fall, it was like after career, not before career. Like, very strange.
Yeah, or
Well,
they're
also,
on Rise Up or whatever, yeah.
To know intimate details of the filming of Maniac Cop, but not remember your childhood best friend, that's a weird place to find oneself in.
Yeah, that's really weird.
She was hot.
Excellent eulogy there.
Yeah.
Rahul, she was hot.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I got my picture with her. I'm looking at pictures of her now. I'm pretty positive she was at one of those cons.
I imagine it's difficult to get your picture with Julie Strain. You know, it's like you have to work some angles to make that happen correctly.
Yeah, was she like 6'1"?
Yeah, she was awful tall.
I think the book was actually called something like 6'1" and Worth the Climb.
Absolutely. I went with my dad. That was like me and my dad's only bonding time. We kind of had a rough go of it. But when we went, dude, he would take pictures of me with everybody. So, and he threw down money too to have me get pictures. So my memory is just garbage. I can't remember. But I'm pretty sure I got my picture with her.
Mac, having experienced this as a fully grown-ass man, how did you respond to the movie?
Okay, so obviously they left Tarna for last, right? It was the best animation. It was the most complete, longest story with like an actual story arc and conclusion. So Tarna was the best. She's on the cover of the DVD, Blu-ray, VHS, fucking Betamax for a reason. This was the best story of the bunch, hands down. And it was like what in my brain heavy metal is. You know what I mean? Like, and I don't know if that's because I have more familiarity with like the DVD cover than I do with the actual magazines. But this is to me what I always thought heavy metal is. It's this fantasy shit, and I know it's, you know, there is a lot more sci-fi stuff in it too. But anyway, you know, heavy metal, chicks scantily clad with swords riding winged beasts. To me, that is like the encyclopedia boiled down definition of heavy metal. So for the last story, that's like I got what I was expecting, and I thought it was good. I think animation rocked. The story was fine. The in-boss battle was cool. Good to go. No problems there. The rest of it was strange to kind of shitty short stories. I liked Harry Cannon. I thought Den sucked. I thought Captain Stern sucked. I thought B-17 was so short. It was just like there. It was fine. So Beautiful, So Dangerous was so weird and sort of like there's no story to it. But I thought the animation was really cool. And, you know, that's where I can really recognize like John Candy's voice and stuff. So that was kind of cool. You know, I thought the most impressive thing was I like rotoscoping. Like you guys said, I just like rotoscoping. So the stories were short enough that I was able to make it through heavy metal with no problem at all. This was not a chore. It's broken up into tiny little bite-sized bits, and it changes pace so quickly that even in the shitty stories, they're over and we're on to the next one. So I thought it was kind of cool. Understanding it's now, like, if I had no idea what this was and I watched it, it'd probably not be great, I guess. But kind of, you know, putting myself back in 1981 or whenever this came out, and this shit was actually like in movie theaters. I don't know. It's kind of cool. that they actually were able to pull this off and put it in theaters. You know what I mean? I think it's kind of cool.
Yeah, and I'm in a somewhat similar boat. I have the same problem with heavy metal that I have with something like a Watchmen, where I got to it too late, and so I'd already lived in the wake of the impact it would have had. So, I had already seen a bunch of anime by the time heavy metal hit VHS. I'd actually read the magazine. I think it's a good reflection of the magazine, although obviously none of the stories go in as deeply as the magazine can go. And I enjoy it well enough for what it is. I wish the animation were better. I think a lot of the animation is kind of rough looking, and they definitely have a sort of a superficial pass at what heavy metal is, where it could have gone a little bit deeper. Even the Tarna story, it just sort of meanders, and it doesn't really get much into, like the societies or any of the meteor stuff. It's all about the, painting on the side of a van aspect of it. But I mean, I respect heavy metal for what it is, and I enjoy it well enough. It's not like I'm hating while I'm watching or anything like that. I like it fine, but it doesn't impact me as much because I had already seen too many things that were influenced by it or that shared influences with it that hit me harder. But I am glad it exists, and I don't mind watching it every now and again. It's just not as a go-to for me. I would say that I probably like the soundtrack better than the movie itself. And again, that wasn't necessarily the type of music I listened to growing up, but I think it's a really well put together soundtrack, and it's not as hard as it could be and maybe should be, but it's hard enough while definitely still attracting me with the pop and the melodies and such. So I really enjoy listening to it. I enjoy the vibe of it. I appreciate its ambition and what it's trying to do. I don't think it quite gets there, but I still respect it nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, and again, there's some like legit bands on here. Blue Oyster Cult's legit. There's a couple Sabbath tracks, and it was like Dio Sabbath, so it's sort of, Devo. We've gone through. There's like legit stuff on here, which I think is kind of cool for kind of being a cultish, low budget animated movie, right? I mean, it's kind of cool, but it is like bro, if you like Akira, this ain't, you know what I mean? It's not on that same level, right? I mean, like you said, for being an animated movie, I would really have wished that the whole movie was like Tarna level, and it's really not. And really, it's even Tarna by Japanese animation standards is nowhere close, right?
Okay, so let me do my thing now. So they tried that with the second one. That was supposed to be the one story, Tarna, the whole thing. That's why it sucked. I was lucky enough to watch this at a young age where it definitely influenced my taste in films. After watching this, it was really hard to go back to Transformers and G.I. Joe and like really enjoy them, because it's like, yeah, but you'll never get shot. No one dies. Where's the tit? It wasn't as fun. I guess I was lucky enough to catch it, like I said, at a young age, where I still love this movie to this day. I've watched so many times, I've lost count. I love the fact that there are different art styles. I don't watch this to like have some deep, emotional this story. I just enjoy their small snippets of stories. They're goofy, weird. The art styles are always different. I mean, I love this movie. I absolutely love this movie. I have what do you call it? What's a good term for it's one of the building blocks of my life, of my adulthood, where this movie influenced me. Now, I watched Akira when it first came out, and those movies are beautiful, great. The stories are amazing, but there's just something about this is that guilty pleasure that I can sit through. I watch Akira every once in a while, but it's kind of heavy, and I do get and also depends on what version of Akira. Like, there's multiple versions with different voice actors, and so the dialogue changes a little bit. I remember seeing the very, very first one of VHS on a bootleg VHS. This is just like it's a comfort food for me. I watch it and I know what I'm going to get. I love it. Never get tired of it. Soundtrack is awesome. Stories are awesome. Boobs and blood. Couldn't ask better.
Well, and again, for me, my heavy metal is the Kentucky Fried Movie. I'm glad we actually brought it up earlier, because that's what it is for me. It's these short skits. Are any of them amazing? No, but before they start, they end again. You get a couple chuckles out of it. And I remember when I was a kid watching this, being like, I should not be exposed to this right now. I'm way too young for this, and absolutely loving it, right? And it is. I think it affected my humor. You know what I mean? It just like this movie probably affected some of the shit that you ended up kind of liking.
Oh yeah,
right. I like skit shows, and I always have, and a lot of that might be because of somewhat affected by the Kentucky Fried Movie. I love Kids in the Hall. These are the things that were like the building blocks of my sense of humor.
Yeah.
And so I think if I would have been exposed to heavy metal at that age, it would be like, you know what? Don't fuck with heavy metal with me. Like, it's like you had to be there. You know what I mean? With heavy metal, you had to be there, and that's why I'm trying to put my mind in the mindset of when this movie came out. And it wasn't extremely popular when it came out, but I bet the people that went and saw it, they never fucking forgot this shit. You know what I mean? Like, I bet it really really did make a huge influence on people because it was so different and so unlike anything else produced in North America and put in wide release in movie theaters. You know what I mean? And Fire and Ice and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I distinctly remember after watching this and then trying to go back to regular cartoons was like doing heroin. I'm assuming doing heroin and then trying to go back to normal life. And you're just like, I want some more of that. I really, really want some more of what I did last night. And I just couldn't find it until I found Bouchy and started watching, like, you know, like we were talking about Fire and Ice and all those movies. And you still get that same, at least for me, I get the same enjoyment. I watch these movies at least once a year that I can think of. Wizard, definitely Wizard, Fire and Ice, and Heavy Metal. I watch, if not once a year, maybe every 2 years, but I sit down and watch it. For this podcast alone, I've seen it like 3 times.
Yeah, well, or even like for me, it was Dark Crystal was another one.
Ooh, good one.
I'll never forget Dark Crystal when I saw it as a kid. And not popular, but when you realize that it's the Muppets guy,
yeah,
like it's Kermit the Frog or Dark Crystal, you know what I mean? And then you just never see anything like Dark Crystal ever again.
Oh, no.
You know what I mean? And part of it was because it was a failure, you know what I mean? But I didn't know that when I was a kid. For me, it was just something that I rarely was able to catch on TV. And when it came on, I had to stop everything I was doing and watch it, you know? And
I was going to throw in there too with like The Secret of NIMH and The Black Cauldron also, where it was a little bit more mature than the average cartoon. And the exposure to that was probably foundational for some people for a generation.
Another one for me was The Last Unicorn was another one where I would just like...
Oh, yes. That's the one I was thinking of.
Yeah, randomly catch it. And again, folks, you got to remember, this was like the 80s where you couldn't just go Google it and find it online. You would just happen to catch it. You know what I mean? You'd be flipping through the channels and accidentally find it. And you would never catch it at the beginning. You'd catch it halfway through, or you catch it a quarter of the way through. And for some people, they never saw the first 20 minutes of one of these movies. You always happen to catch it 15, 20 minutes in. So then when you actually finally see the whole thing all the way through, you're like, oh, holy shit, I'd only seen the last like 45 minutes of it. You know what I mean? I'm sure there are instances of that happening. So yeah, to me, although I didn't see Heavy Metal at that time, if I would have, it would have been one of those for me. It would have been The Last Unicorn. It would have been Dark Crystal. Just these random offbeat shows that you happen to catch. Anyway.
And the crazy thing for me is I remember catching The Last Unicorn on the late show that played at like 3 a.m. back when we only had like 4 channels. And I remember, you know, at the time we weren't doing too great, so we all slept in one bedroom. So I would have to stack the pillows behind me so they couldn't see the TV, so it wouldn't wake them up. And I would sit at the front of the TV and have the volume really low. I mean, I was like really close to the TV so I could watch TV at 3 a.m. because I knew they were going to show really weird shit at the late show. You remember that, Frank?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we referenced earlier all these things that I saw, you know, like your Herschel Gordon Lewis's and shit, all this stuff that was like the naughty stuff and the weird stuff that you could only get on the late show. So yeah, definitely. Because I mean, the whole reason why we did this podcast is, you know, like neither me nor Mac have any a special affection for the movie itself, but I know this is such a fundamental movie for you, and it's reflective of who you are. It's like this movie has the same vibe as you, that swagger, that oversexed quality, that intellectualism and that imagination as well. It's like this Heavy Metal is totally your vibe, and so like I don't want to bag on the movie too much, and that's why I wanted to have a celebration of the magazine and the greater impact of Heavy Metal. But this is like your baby, and this is such a representation of who you are and where your interests are that we had to celebrate the 40th anniversary and talk about the magazine and the greater impact and everything else.
No, I appreciate it. Yeah, no, when you said you wanted to do this, I was a happy little clam. I'm like, oh, I'm down for this.
So for the Masters of the Universe Revelations episode, thanks go out to Dr. Ann, Baby Skeletor, the Bat Pod, who added all in on this one, Canoes, Chris at Bat Books for Beginners, Chris Dunford, Chris Lydon, Del Dracula, Doc Strain, Amel, Gregory Litchfield, The Hammer Strikes, Geeky Stuff and Voiceover, History of Comics on Film, Iowa's Joe Crawford, It's Plastic Man, Jeffrey Brown They Them, Jenna Reagan, who added nice artwork, JMT Productions, Keith G. Baker, Ken Yama 65, Harry Kemp, Lucretia, Lukashin Sergei, K, Mark Thomas, Martin Gray, Michael Wagner on Facebook, Mike Send Aliens to Me, Office Barista, Paul K. Bisson, Photo Druid Dusseldorf, Randy Caldwell, Resurrections and Adam Warlock and Thanos Podcast, Richard Field, Richard G, Rob Klippel, Samilla, Scott X, Tim Price the Podcrasher, Ufta, Weapon Extra is a Plural System, and Genozoic Xenophile. Martin Gray added, I may have to listen. The last time I came across a Master of the Universe story was DC Comics Presents. Richard G wrote, thrilled to be included. I need to still get on this series. Relive a childhood show moment in a new age. Hero on. Finally, Firehole informed us the 2000 cartoon actually did very well. Two big reasons it was canceled. Very expensive show to make for the time, and the main reason, toy line sold for shit. Back in the 80s, the line died because of new kids not having access to the main characters. So for the 2000 line, they had a ton of repainted He-Man Skeletors and new figs at one per case. Collectors wouldn't support the line with that ratio, and like you said, kids just didn't or don't sync with He-Man anymore.